Hello and welcome to 6 Part. Today I'm gonna start a new series, What If Deku Had a Legendary Fire Quirk? Part 1. If you enjoy this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
Our story starts at UA's esteemed hero school. The symbol of peace, All Might, is the most well-known of the many heroes who have passed through its halls. A boy with bright red hair sat in one classroom, his hair pulled back in a thin ponytail. He was Hisashi Midoriya, a student in UA's business course, and he was wearing the school's distinctive uniform. Given that this would be his first year, he hoped to graduate with honors. Fire Breath was Hisashi's quirk, which could have earned him a spot in the hero course, but he wasn't interested in that. He wanted to pursue a career in business, and since UA was the top hero school, he could network in the future. Alright, students, listen up. I know this is only the first day of your first year, but I'll be giving you your end of the year assignment right now. Hisashi's golden eyes moved across the classroom, seeing the nervous looks of his fellow students. Alright, calm down, it's not as dire as you might believe. You have a full year to finish this assignment, which is why I'm giving it to you now. The task is as follows. Their teacher's gaze swept across the classroom to ensure he had every student's focus. You will interview the other first-year students and establish a partnership with your selected student once the classes of I, J, and K are transferred to the hero courses. You will be in charge of assisting them with their public persona for the remainder of the year and suggesting heroes for work studies and internships that will enhance their reputation. Consider these to be training grounds for handling heroes in your chosen field of work. As with everything in life, it's unfair, of course, because there will only be 24 students in the hero course compared to 36 in the business course. To find a student you can work with, you will need to use information and your intuition. You all have tablets that are loaded with data about the 24 pupils. You'll have time to get to know your chosen hero to be and assist them with their internships because the sports festival ended a few days ago. I will review each hero course student's public image at the end of the year and compare it to where they began following the sports festival. Your grade will be reflected in their station by then. With 24 choices and 36 choosers, Hisashi's eye pricked up at the thought that UA was already bare its teeth. He would have to consider his options and make a wise decision, but he couldn't wait around for too long. Sensei, what happens to those of us who can't find a hero student to work with? Hisashi inquired, and his teacher smiled grimly. For those of you who don't choose a partner out of the 24 students will have to choose from the support course, choosing an inventor and making a portfolio for their creations and how to market them to prospective buyers. The entire class of One Eye moaned. Now that I've lit a fire under you, let's line up and make our way over to the heroics department. There was a mad rush to be the first in line so they could be the first to enter the classroom and get their shot in. Hisashi was one of the few who didn't rush to line up because he had already made his decision and was certain that no one else would look in this person's direction. All right, students, the first 9 will go in and make their choices, and then the next 9, Hisashi said, observing his fellow business students as they frantically flipped through their tablets, making sure of their choices and perhaps uttering a few prayers that they could get at least one of them. The 3 business classes were split between the 2 hero courses, meaning that each class had 18 students instead of 12. We won't be complaining because we'll be going by seat number. The frantic rush to be the first in line was for nothing when their teacher said, the 3 students with seat numbers 1, 2, and 3 go inside. Hisashi grinned. Hisashi took seat number 3 and walked in with all the assurance of a CEO. While his classmates went around, likely intending to talk to every student and proceed from there, while others had only one person on their list and would proceed accordingly, Hisashi was in the latter group and he walked past the other students to stand in front of another red-headed youth, who was at least a head taller than him and had 2 stacks of papers, one of which appeared to be a list of hero agencies and the other a list of crime reports. When Hisashi approached the redhead, the class fell silent. There were many rumors about what he might be thinking, but Hisashi chose to ignore them all. He had a plan, and this person was the only one who could finish it. The redhead did not acknowledge Hisashi's presence, even though he was standing in front of him. Hisashi coughed rough before saying, "Hi, I'm Hisa." Hisashi's well-planned introduction was cut short by a rough voice that said, "Go away. I have no interest in whatever you're doing, so go bother someone else." The redhead continued to reject Hisashi without apology, and after standing there for a while, Hisashi put his tablet away and slammed his hands on the boy's desk. The class jumped at the loud nose that stared at the 2 redheads. Enji's blue eyes glared at Hisashi as he looked up from the paper in his hands and said, "Excuse me, Enji Todoroki. My name is Hisashi Midoriya, and I will be your heroic profile manager." "What?" As Hisashi went on, he snarled, "Let me draw your attention to a few points right now. Hisashi pulled out his tablet and opened a window that showed Enji's popularity after the sports festival. You are the winner of the sports festival, and your likability should be at least 90%, but here you are at 50. Do you know what that means? It means that no matter how much crime you stop, no matter how many villains you put away, you will be mediocre at best. Stopping crime is only half of what people want from a hero. They want their heroes to be beacons, someone they can look up to and admire. You know, someone they actually like. Hisashi commanded, pressing the tablet closer to Enji's face. Even other heroes aren't that willing to take you on. As the winner of the sports festival, heroes should be breaking down this classroom door to get a piece of you, and yet you only have a few hundred requests. Is that good enough for you? Because it sure as hell shouldn't be. Hisashi drove home his point. All of the students gazed at Enji Todoroki, the red-headed business student in a disguise. You said in your speech that you wanted to be a greater hero than All Might, not be the next All Might, but to beat him, right? You can't do that with a crappy personality, which is all people will see if you don't let me manage you. No one else here wants to partner with you. They would all rather deal with the maniacs in the support department than have to try and manage you. Not me, I'm not scared of a challenge. In fact, I want a challenge. If you want to beat All Might, then I want to be the person that helped you do that. So how about you and me go for broke plus ultra and all that? He gestured to Enji. After a moment of staring at the other redhead, Enji grinned cockily and got to his feet. Enji held out his hand to Hisashi, who swiftly accepted it. You've got guts, Midoriya. Okay then, but if you hold me back I'll kick you to the side like a pebble in the road, he said. Hisashi grinned and pulled up a chair as Enji took a seat. Same here, you screw over my management possibilities, I'll drop you like a hot potato. Now let's get to work, he said. Hisashi and Enji's collaboration launched both young men into their chosen fields. Hisashi was able to gradually raise Enji's public likability by controlling his rather problematic personality. Assisting Enji in selecting the best organizations to take advantage of everything he had to offer in order to demonstrate to others what kind of hero Endeavor would be. Since Hisashi was able to handle such an unlikable person, numerous hero management agencies were vying for the young man's services. After graduating, their business partnership turned into a friendship that they both cherished. Enji insisted that Hisashi be the only person in charge of his portfolio, and Hisashi made sure that Endeavor, his primary client, was never neglected. The two stayed close over the years, and even after Hisashi began working abroad, he found time to serve as Enji's best man at his wedding to Rei, where he met Inko, a sweet and adorable caterer. As Hisashi's best man, Enji returned the favor a few years later. Nevertheless, Hisashi was unable to observe his friend's increasing obsession because he was unable to see Enji in person. His desire to surpass All Might started to consume his friend, pushing him to take drastic steps in order to fulfill that ambition. After learning that Inko was expecting their first child, Hisashi went back to Japan so he could finally talk to his friend in person. As they clinked their sake cups together, Hisashi and Enji sat in the Todoroki household's living room. Enji said, "Welcome back," while taking a sip of his sake. Hisashi laughed out loud. He made fun of the other person's rough greeting by saying, "Gee, don't get all weepy on me, Enji. But thanks, it's good to be back home for this month. To be honest, I'm nervous, it'll be my first kid. Do you have any advice for a new dad? I mean, you just had your fourth kid," Hisashi said while Enji was looking elsewhere. "Rei was the one who mostly raised them, but I have high hopes for Shoko. I think she will have the perfect combination of our quirks. Toya can't do what I need him to." Hisashi raised his eyebrows in agreement. "Enji, he's still your son. I know you wanted him to be a hero like you, and it's a bad break. His body can't handle his firepower, but you can't just swap him out like a broken wrench, and besides, Shoko's only 6 months old. It's a bit early to put that kind of expectation on her," Hisashi said with a sigh. "Enji, I know you're still chasing after that dream you had when we first met, and I want you to know I still believe you can do it. I believe that the hero Endeavor can be the #1 hero in Japan. I mean, isn't that why you chose that name? Endeavor to be better. You can't be better by making the same mistakes. Don't go down the same path with Shoko that you went down with Tuya," Hisashi continued. Hisashi drained his sake cup and poured himself another, saying, "To be honest, I don't care if my son has my quirk, his mother's quirk, or something entirely different. I just want him to grow up happy and healthy." Without a word, Enji turned to face his old friend. He listened to what his friend had to say, but was he truly any better? Despite pursuing All Might for years, he was only ranked #2. He wasn't sure he could pull it off. If not Tuya, then Shoko. He had to leave his ambition to his kids. "You said you're having a boy?" Enji inquired, and Hisashi nodded. "Inko told me right before I got on the plane. The doctor said we'd be having a boy. I couldn't be happier than Inko. She's so overjoyed I don't even think she was this happy at our wedding." Hisashi laughed. Enji nodded after glancing at Hisashi. "If your son does want to be a hero, I'll train him," Enji said, as if she had just said it. Hisashi raised an eyebrow and then laughed knowingly. "You know you could just say you want our kids to be friends, Enji. You don't have to hide it behind an offer of hero training, but thank you nonetheless. I hope Shoko will take care of Izuku too." "That's the name Inko came up with, by the way. I think it's a good strong name," Hisashi said while Enji nodded. The flame hero concurred, saying, "I hope he develops into a man worthy of it. It is a strong name." Hisashi and Inko Midoriya welcomed their son into the world a week later. In front of another boy on the ground, a young boy with red, fluffy hair was holding his arm and trying in vain to contain his tears. To another boy with crimson eyes and ashen blonde hair, the red-haired boy yelled, "That's enough, Kachan, he's crying." A thin stream of smoke belched into the air as the blonde boy, sporting an aggressive grin, slammed his left fist into his right hand, causing a small explosion. "Deku, you don't even have a quirk," yelled the blonde boy named Kachan. "Are you going to stop me?" The redhead boy assumed a makeshift combat stance, spreading his legs and lifting his fists. With his green eyes gleaming with resolve, the redhead yelled, "If you don't stop, I'll fight you." He approached, and the blonde scoffed. The boy, Izuku Midoriya, was rushing toward him when he yelled, "Fine then." Izuku was shocked. He hadn't thought Kachan would really try to fight him over this, but he couldn't give up. Izuku threw a punch, mentally yelling, "Quirk or not, I have to protect people because I want to be a hero." That day, Izuku Midoriya finally understood when fire shot from his elbow, moved down his forearm, and blasted off his closed hand, forming a misshapen fist that struck Kachan's chest, knocking the boy back and burning a hole in his shirt. The blonde paused his haste to glance at Izuku, whose right arm was emitting a tiny haze of heat from the flames. Two women hurried toward their respective sons while the two boys gazed at each other. The two boys swiftly worked things out, but as he was being led away, Izuku turned to face his mother, his eyes the same deep green as hers. Mom, did you see my quirk?" "I have a quirk," exclaimed Izuku, ecstatic and beaming. Inko, his mother, sighed as she gazed down at her son. She had to be his mother for the moment, but she wanted to congratulate her son on his first quirk activation. "I saw, Izuku, but now that you have your quirk, you need to be careful with it and learn how to control it. You want to be a hero, right? Heroes don't use their powers to needlessly hurt people. They use it to protect and help people, okay? Promise me you won't use your quirk to bully people," Inko said with a stern tone as Izuku glanced and grinned. The mention of Uncle Enji caused Izuku's eyes to widen once more. "I promise, Mom, I'll only use my power to help people, like All Might and Uncle Enji," he said. Izuku begged his mother, who sighed once more, "Oh Mom, can we go over to Uncle Enji's? I want to show Shoko my quirk, pretty please." In addition to perhaps it was best to take him to Enji, she couldn't resist that face, even though she should take Izuku to the doctor to find out exactly what she would be dealing with moving forward. Given that the hero Endeavor possessed one of the most potent flame quirks in history and that Hisashi was currently abroad, she didn't really have anyone else to turn to. As they walked to Inko's car, she said to her son, "Okay, Izuku, we can go, but don't be disappointed if they're busy." In keeping with their promise, Izuku and Shoko became close friends throughout their childhood. In fact, Izuku and the Todoroki children treated the house like a second home, treating each other like siblings. Natsuo always had something funny to say or entertaining games to play, so he enjoyed spending time with him. Then there was Fuyumi, who always treated him well and ensured their safety. She seemed to be a mother as well. Lastly, Uncle Enji was training Tuya to be a hero because he was so cool and had a powerful fire quirk. On the ride over, Izuku reflected, "Perhaps my quirk will be that strong when I'm older." He had known Shoko for ages, so it goes without saying that she was his best friend. Indeed, once Izuku acquired his quirk, he and Shoko had vowed to become heroes together. I bet Shoko will be so excited when I show her. Before Inko could even close the car door, Izuku was already running up to the front door when mother and son arrived at the Todoroki residence. After her son, Inko yelled, "Izuku, slow down." Izuku ran to the door and gave it a quick knock. The little redhead was there when Fuyumi opened the door. Fuyumi said, "Hi, Izuku," as the young boy slipped by her and kicked off his shoes. Just as Inko reached the door, he saw his red hair whipping around the corner. "Fuyumi, I got my quirk, he yelled as he ran down the hall. Inko apologized as the young girl giggled, saying, "I'm so sorry Fuyumi, he's just so excited." After saying, "It's okay, come on in. My mom is in the living room," Fuyumi ushered Inko inside. Izuku waved briefly to Rei and Natsuo as he rushed past the living room. Izuku could run the Todoroki house backwards and blindfolded because he had been there so many times. When he threw open the door to Shoko's room, he discovered it was empty. He sulked as he heard a door close by open, saying, "Ah, she's not here." Izuku noticed Tuya standing in his doorway as he glanced down the hall. His arms and legs were covered in bandages, and his once red hair had turned nearly white. Izuku raised his hand and lit a tiny flame in the palm of it before it gutted out. "Tuya, where is Shoko? I want to show her that I got my quirk," he said. Izuku was too focused on finding Shoko to notice his pseudo-elder brother's lifeless blue eyes as he gazed at the spot where the flame had been in Izuku's hand. He grabbed his door and hurriedly closed it, saying, "She's probably in the dojo with Dad." Before the door closed, Izuku glanced up in time to see Tuya's blue eyes glow eerily in the shadows of his room. Izuku stared at the door for a few seconds before rushing down the hall to the dojo. "I'm okay, thanks Tuya," he said. The young boy felt that Izuku took far too long to get to the dojo. He was exhausted, but at last he had accomplished his objective. Shoko was standing there when Izuku flung open the door. She wore a pink shirt and black shorts, and a headband held back her long red and white hair. She held her hands defensively in front of her, her bare feet braced against the dojo's polished wood. "That's not good enough, Shoko, you need to create a fire shield to block. Now do it again," Enji grumbled. Wearing gray gym pants and a white muscle shirt, the number 2 hero stood on the other end of the dojo and threw a fireball the size of a softball at the 4-year-old. Shoko tried intermittently to summon a fire shield to block the fireball as it approached her at a moderate pace. Shoko appeared to have it at last and held the shield in front of her, but it extinguished just as the fireball struck her, slamming into her hands and knocking her down. Before noticing Izuku standing in the doorway, Enji gave the order, "You're not concentrating enough. That shield needs to be your sole focus. Now get up, we're not leaving until you block my attack." Enji questioned, "What are you doing here?" as Izuku approached Shoko, who was fighting back tears. Izuku asked his best friend, who was kneeling next to him and staring up at him with tears in her eyes, "Are you okay, Shoko?" "Izuku?" she asked, perplexed, and Izuku nodded. The flame flickered and was quickly extinguished as Izuku repeated, "Yep, it's me. I wanted to show you I got my quirk." Enji growled, "I asked you a question, boy," and Izuku turned to face him as he got up and assisted Shoko in standing up. Izuku looked at Enji and stated his goal resolutely. "I got my quirk today, Uncle Enji, and I want to train too," he said. Enji turned to face the boy with the red hair. Although Hisashi was likely the only person Enji would consider a friend, he was aware of Hisashi's weakness. Izuku had promised to keep his word, but Enji didn't think his quirk would be any more powerful. As he made a fireball, he said, "Okay, stand next to Shoko. It's simple, I'll toss a fireball at you and you'll use your flames to block it. Concentrate on your fire and make a shield. Visualize it in your mind," Enji said while Izuku nodded. With his hands clasped together, he pushed a fire into being. A flame ignited in Izuku's hand at Enji's encouragement. "Imagine your hands getting warmer, hotter, and hotter from there. Imagine grabbing the sun with your hands." After nodding, the flame hero turned to face his daughter, who was still having trouble starting a large flame. With a sneer, Enji turned back to face Izuku. Enji asked, "Ready?" As Izuku nodded, his perspiring face unable to focus long enough to speak, Enji watched as the fireball struck Izuku and knocked him down. Enji gave a headshake. As he turned back to Shoko and watched her produce a medium-sized flame in her hand, Enji thought, "That's what I expected. A couple more knockdowns and he'll quit." Compared to her previous flame, which was lighter in size, this one was better. After saying, "Here it comes, Shoko," Enji threw the fireball at her. Shoko braced herself, but she was able to stay upright even though her flame sputtered once more and Enji's fireball struck her bare hands. As her palms turned red, Shoko shook her hands and whimpered. "I told you before, Shoko, you need to make a bigger flame. That pitiful flame isn't going to protect you," Enji yelled. Enji's tirade was cut short when Izuku stood up again and declared, "I'm ready, Uncle Enji." While holding a flame, as he threw another fireball at Izuku, Enji scowled and left Shoko alone for the time being. This time, the boy's fire failed, causing the fireball to crash into his hands, but he remained upright. Enji tried to use smaller words so that Izuku would remember it. "The fire was a good size, but you need to to make the fire move faster," he said. It didn't matter because he was certain that Izuku would resign following the next setback. Izuku nodded his head while shaking his hands, which were turning pink from the fireball. Yes sir, Izuku replied, already getting ready to light another flame. As Enji scowled, Shoko grumbled, Dad, can we stop, my hands hurting? Even now, Enji could see the flame sputtering. I told you we're not leaving until you complete this exercise, Shoko, now get that fire up. Enji ordered as Shoko raised her hands once more to form a fire shield. Even if he did nothing, it would go out on its own, but he needed Shoko to understand, so he threw his fireball, and naturally, his daughter's feeble shield did not keep her safe. He turned to Izuku and threw a fireball after shaking his head without even trying to reply to his daughter. Enji saw the fireball strike Izuku's shield before coming to a halt. When Enji noticed that Izuku's shield was still in place, his eyebrows raised a little. Again, Enji declared, launching another fireball that the shield once more deflected. Izuku was drenched in sweat as he stood there, focusing entirely on his shield. One more time, Enji said, becoming intrigued by the young man as he threw a fireball. The boy's shield appeared to be at its breaking point after the third blow, and he fell on his butt while panting. Izuku sat there catching his breath, his whole body drenched in sweat. For the first time since he trained Tuya, Enji saw a future with a flame hero as the most popular hero in Japan as he gazed at Izuku sitting there. He glanced at Izuku, who was attempting to stand up steadily so he could continue, and then at Shoko, who was standing there trembling like a leaf. He had placed his hopes on Shoko, believing that she would be the one to continue his dream because of both his and Rei's peculiarities, but perhaps he ought to have looked elsewhere. Enji said, Shoko, you can go, startling his daughter as she glanced up at her father. Enji was not even glancing at her. His azure eyes were fixed on Izuku. Even at her age, Shoko was aware that her father no longer believed in her. She couldn't do it, in his opinion. Her father felt let down by her. Shoko's eyes welled up with tears once more. In her father's eyes, she was a failure. Someone grabbed the young girl's hand as she started to go toward the door. Izuku looked at his friend and wiped perspiration from his brow. Wait, Shoko, you can do this, he said. Izuku took Shoko's hands in his own and said, I'll help you. He looked into Shoko's mismatched green eyes and said, make a fire. Shoko muttered, I can't, Izuku, I can't do it, but Izuku gave her a firm handshake. Izuku looked into Shoko's eyes and exclaimed, we're going to be heroes, right? I want you to be a hero right by me, don't you? He was shocked by Shoko's refusal to leave her. Izuku aspired to join her as a hero. Shoko nodded. Meekly, she wiped the tears from her eyes and turned to face her father, saying, I want to be a hero too. Enji had silently observed the conversation as Izuku in some way motivated his daughter. Her expression was unexpectedly determined. Izuku had accomplished what he had been unable to do during the final days of Shoko's training. Shoko closed her eyes and concentrated on the warmth of Izuku's hands alone. That's right, Shoko, now come on, make a fire, think of something warm, Izuku said. She allowed that sensation to consume all of her attention, and when she opened her eyes, she felt a fierce fire in her hands. Izuku and Shoko both grinned, then Shoko turned to face her father and raised her hands. Enji threw a fireball and watched it smash against Shoko's shield, saying, seems like you're ready. At last, her shield held. Even with that advantage, Izuku had chosen to support and encourage Shoko, pushing her to overcome her shortcomings. Enji had assumed that Izuku wouldn't amount to much, but the boy appeared to have a greater talent for his quirk than his own daughter. A Midoriya had once again shown his strategies to be ineffective. Enji put his hands on his hips and sighed. Enji dismissed the two kids, who gave a small smile before stuttering out the door, and said, that's enough for now, go and rest up. We'll start training again in an hour. When Enji was by himself, he reflected on his training with Tuya and saw that he had made the same mistake he had made when he drove his children too fast and too far. Enji left the room without noticing his oldest son standing close by, listening to everything he said. Hisashi was right, I can't make the same mistakes I did with Tuya. I have to be better for Shoko and Izuku, he said. I'm a mistake? Tuya addressed the deserted corridor. Nobody realized at the time that Tuya would soon leave their house and their lives. Enji heard the door slide open and found himself standing in the dojo once more. He turned to face Izuku and Shoko, who were now 14 years old, and asked, are you two ready? Izuku was wearing black shorts and a deep green muscle shirt. His green eyes glistened with excitement, and his curly red hair was cropped close to his head. Shoko's red and white hair was styled in a long, flowing ponytail. She wore blue tights and a black muscle shirt. Enji could see a determined light hidden in the depths of her mismatched eyes, which were steady and calm. Both yelled, yes sir, and assumed a combat stance. While Shoko stayed in her starting position, Izuku moved forward. Endeavor looked at both to make sure they were prepared. "Begin!" exclaimed Enji. Izuku's feet caught fire at his mark, sending him flying across the dojo's wood. In a matter of seconds, he was on Enji and jumped up, his foot encased in flames, heading for a roundhouse. Izuku's preference for hand-to-hand combat over mid- and long-range combat was not surprising. He was undoubtedly copying All Might's style. Enji saw a carpet of ice roaring toward him and ducked under the blow. He grinned at how well the two worked together. While Shoko used her superior long-range skills to trap him, Izuku was supposed to divert his attention with a dazzling attack. Enji stomped his foot to the floor and yelled, "Good, but not good enough." A curtain of flame swiftly broke through Shoko's ice. When he looked up, he saw Izuku cover his hands with flame and physically grab Enji's rising flame curtain, riding it higher before flipping it over and landing a flaming axe kick on the number 2 hero. Enji smiled as he leapt back to dodge the blow and then blasted Izuku with a stream of fire. As Enji's flamethrower split around them, Izuku, to his credit, held his ground and slapped his flame-covered hands together, creating a wedge with his fingertips aimed directly at it, similar to water circling a stone. Enji thought to himself, he's gotten better at manipulating others' flames. He then barely avoided a block of ice that had fallen from the ceiling. He noticed a thin trail of ice leading to the spot where the block of ice had fallen, and Shoko standing with her right hand on the dojo wall. Izuku appeared on his right with a flaming fist, interrupting Enji's thoughts. Her fire is weaker than mine or Izuku's, but her subtle manipulation of both her ice and fire is superb. Izuku yelled, "Today's the day." But Enji's burning finger was placed against his forehead and his punch was sidelined. The young boy's flames sputtered out a look of disappointment as he stood up and rubbed the pink dot on his forehead from Enji's finger. "Not quite Izuku," Enji said. Izuku went to the front of the dojo and got a pair of towels, throwing one to Shoko as the two cleaned themselves. "I thought we had you," he said. As Izuku wiped the towel across his face and Shoko wiped herself down, Enji remarked, "It was closer than any other time. I feel you're ready for a higher difficulty before UA's entrance exams. Even though you two will have my recommendation, there will be no slacking." "We know, father," Shoko said, rubbing her spotless face with the towel. Izuku said, "What she said, uncle, but I should head out, I'll be late for school," taking his school bag and throwing the towel into a nearby hamper. Hisashi and Enji refused to want Izuku to attend a private school, despite Enji's offer to have him attend the same institution as Shoko Inko. As Shoko nodded and tossed her towel over her shoulder, Izuku said, "Oh, Shoko, my mom wanted to know if you'd like to come over for dinner tonight." She responded to Izuku in a soft voice, "Sure, I'd love to." He said with a smile, "Okay, I'll stop by your school later to pick you up." Then he vanished around the corner. For a moment, Shoko just stared at the spot where Izuku had vanished. Enji went by. As Shoko glared at him, he snapped her out of her reverie with the order, "Stop staring and get ready for school." As she walked out of the dojo, she muttered, "I wasn't staring." While the rest of his class engaged in small talk, Izuku sat in his classroom thinking back on this morning's training session with Endeavor. His teacher came into the room carrying a pile of papers, and he looked up. The teacher reached his desk and threw them into the air, saying in a monotone, "Okay, students, calm down. I have something for you. This is a career questionnaire so you can all choose the right schools for your preferred career path." He yelled, "But of course, all of you want to be in the hero course, right?" As the students in the room started yelling and flaunting their quirky characteristics, he laughed before a boy's voice boomed out, Okay, calm down, no using your quirks in public. You're not trying to be a bunch of vigilantes, right?" The ash-blonde Katsuki Bakugo stabbed his thumb into his chest and said, "That's about as close to heroes as these losers will ever be. There's only one guy in this school who's really hero material, and that's me." With the exception of Izuku, all of the other students started insulting Katsuki right away. Izuku just gave a headshake. Unfortunately, that was Katsuki at his core. "Right, Bakugo, you applied to UA." The students fell silent when the top hero school in Japan was mentioned. Katsuki's self-confidence was evident from the fact that he had applied to UA. As the students' gazes shifted to the red-haired boy, including Katsuki's crimson ones, the teacher remarked, "Along with Izuku Midoriya, seems we'll have 2 representatives for our school. I wish you boys the best of luck." As he started to teach, the instructor said, "Well anyway, let's get on with class, shall we?" The classroom door was slammed open with such force that it almost rattled off its track as Izuku was packing his backpack at the end of the school day. As Katsuki approached Izuku, he said, You really think you have a shot, Izuku? Ua doesn't take losers. Izuku raised his head and looked at Katsuki. Izuku responded, sorry to hear that, Katsuki. Looks like you'll have to hope Ketsubutsu does, as the two looked at each other for a moment before grinning and putting their hands together. Katsuki grinned and said, eat shit, you asshole, while Izuku grinned back and let go of his friend's hand. Izuku said, you first, as the two began to leave the classroom. Izuku Midoriya and Katsuki Bakugo had been best friends since they were 4 years old. Izuku's quirk was triggered after a brief altercation between the two. The two had been rivals and close friends ever since. Izuku rolled his eyes as Katsuki said, you want to go to the arcade with me and some of the guys? I can whoop your ass a couple of times, that should be fun. Izuku shook his head and said, does everything have to be a competition with you? Can't we just hang out and not try to beat the snot out of each other? Izuku clarified, anyway, I told Shoko I'd pick her up for dinner with my mom and me, after Katsuki grunted. Izuku nudged Katsuki, who teased, oh, I see, passing me up for your little girlfriend, huh, what a beta. Don't forget to paint her toenails after dinner. Stop it, Shoko's not my girlfriend, besides, you know how Shoko is, she wouldn't let me near her feet anyway. Besides, if being friends with her since childhood makes her my girlfriend, then you're my boyfriend and you haven't even given me a single chocolate these past few Valentine's days. Izuku replied with a grin as Katsuki shoved. Katsuki said, fuck off, asshole. I'll see you on the weekend, and Izuku followed suit as they parted ways. To his knowledge, Shoko's school opened a bit later than his, so Izuku made his way there. As he passed a dark overpass, Izuku took out his phone to check the most recent hero news. When Shoko left the school, she was walking alongside a number of girls. 3 pairs of eyes were on Shoko as the girls said, so Shoko, you're really going to UA next year? That's crazy, but I guess your dad is the number 2 hero, so it makes sense. A second girl with spiral horns said, I couldn't do it, I'm too scared to be a hero. Thank God Mount Lady was there to stop it. They were walking down the main sidewalk when they noticed a red-haired boy standing at the school gate. Shoko's face blushed slightly as the horned girl whispered, ooh, Shoko, your boyfriend is here. As they were within earshot of Izuku, she returned the whisper, he's not my boyfriend, we're just friends. Izuku said, hey, Shoko, you ready to go? And Shoko nodded and gave him a look. As she moved to his side, her friends' collective giggles followed her as they passed. Yeah, let's go. The 6-eyed girl exclaimed, have fun, you two, see you Monday, Shoko, as Izuku raised an eyebrow. As the two left the school, Shoko following Izuku a little to give her blush time to go away, he remarked, oh well, come on then, we should get back, my mom is really excited to see you. As Shoko finally caught up to him, Izuku remarked, can you believe that in just 10 months I and you will be going to UA? It's crazy that soon we'll be taking our first step onto the path of heroism. I can't wait. Izuku nodded, and Shoko added, yeah, I'm sure my dad will be happy. It's what he's always wanted. As he saw a plume of smoke rising, Izuku proudly remarked, yeah, I know, but we're not just doing it for him. This is for us too, right? It's our quirks and we're going to be the heroes we want to be, who just so happen to be the best heroes in the country. Izuku steered toward the smoke cloud and inquired, was there a fire? He experienced intermittent tremors as he approached because the smoke plume was getting thicker. After every tremor, Izuku had accelerated his pace steadily, and Shoko jogged to keep up. Just as an explosion exploded, the two eventually turned a corner and saw a crowd of people gathered at the entrance to a street market. Looking around, Izuku saw that Mount Lady was attempting to fit in the alley while Backdraft was forming a water cordon to keep people back. He also saw Kamui Woods and Death Arms, but what caught his attention was a sludge creature thrashing about with a pair of red eyes that were welling with tears in its depths. Katsuki? Inquired Izuku. Shoko also watched, seeing the well-known blonde in the sludge villain's grasp. When she came to play with Izuku, Shoko had met Katsuki multiple times and was aware that he was a friend of Izuku. In tiny doses, she could understand why Izuku became friends with the boy despite the fact that the blonde was repulsive. Shoko jumped when Izuku yelled, why aren't the heroes doing anything? His green eyes were fixed only on Katsuki. Death Arms was present and could have done something, or Mount Lady, but they were all paralyzed by something. Kamui Woods was saving lives while Backdraft kept people out. They were either unable to take action or were refusing to. Katsuki and Izuku looked at each other as another round of explosions exploded. Izuku knew he was moving the next instant. Izuku jumped over the throng and landed close to the street market's entrance. A second too late, Death Arms and the other heroes saw Izuku as the young man's feet burst into flames, propelling him forward at a dizzying rate. When the sludge villain turned to face this new danger, he saw nothing but a demon. Izuku's glowing green eyes were frightening in the flickering light, but his fist was covered in flames that cast shadows across his face. It all felt like it was happening slowly. There was a hiss of steam coming from the sludge villain's liquid body as Izuku's fist approached. Before Izuku's fist pierced him, his bug eyes had already dried from the force of the blow. As Izuku's flaming punch ate away at his body, all he could feel was heat. There was no time for it to register pain. Izuku was standing there when Katsuki collapsed to the ground. His right sleeve had been burned off, exposing his red, burned skin. But what Katsuki remembered most was the expression in Izuku's eyes. Then there was an expression of bewilderment, then acceptance. There was a brief pause before the villain's liquid body evaporated and his whole body burst into a plume of steam. The villain would only be discovered with their teeth scorched. A villain had been killed by Izuku Midoriya. As the dream faded, Katsuki's eyes opened. He thought that the heat emanating from Izuku was still palpable. He threw off his covers and got out of bed, asking himself, "Why am I dreaming of this now?" Katsuki was wearing shorts and a t-shirt. He looked at his phone and moaned. He was waiting for an unread text. The picture of an icy hot tube was the icon next to the text. "Are you going to be there tonight?" it asked. Before entering the restroom, Katsuki rolled his eyes. Katsuki turned to face the mirror. His blonde hair, which had previously been spiky, was buzz-cut to the top of his head. Memories of Izuku flashed through his mind as he gazed into his red eyes. He shook his head in agreement. He said as he started his morning ritual, "Not now, focus." After finishing, he picked up his phone to finally answer and left his bathroom. After putting the phone in his pocket and getting dressed, he said, "I'll be there. Are we still on for afterward?" and left the room. Katsuki, who is now 20 years old, lived alone in a rather pleasant apartment. He was best known as Best Jeanist's sidekick in Hero Ground Zero. Although he had no intention of stopping there, Katsuki had continued to work with the hero after graduating from UA, where he had interned during his first year. He would go solo and advance through the ranks of Hero Society after a few more years of working under Jeanist, eventually surpassing Endeavor to take the top spot. Before heading down the street, Katsuki leapt off the second-floor walkway and used a tiny explosion to soften his landing. For their morning patrol, he was on his way to Best Jeanist's office. His phone sounded like an explosion as he was walking, alerting him to a text. Seeing that Shoko had responded, he took out his phone. The brief two-word response was exactly like her. "Of course." A car sped by him, followed by multiple police cars, as he swiped the message off his screen and put his phone away. After a brief moment of standing, Katsuki grinned and hurried after the vehicle. After the car chase, he jumped off the ground and blasted a flurry of explosions out behind him to get airborne. When Katsuki saw two men in the car from above, he saw that one of them was armed and that he was shooting at the police, which caused one of the cars to veer off the road and crash into a light post. He swore as he detonated two powerful explosions, sending himself hurtling down onto the car's hood. "Okay fuckers, that's enough." The car's engine was undoubtedly harmed by the crunching metal beneath his landing. Holding his hands together, Katsuki yelled, "Well, you fucked around and now you're about to find out." This caused a series of tiny explosions that rendered the two criminals blind. As he swerved back and forth, the driver yelled, "Shit, I can't see." Hearing the pop and the slap of rubber as the driver's side tire fell away, Katsuki leaned over and blasted it. The car began to swerve in that direction right away, so Katsuki leaned over and did it again with the left tire. When the car slowed down enough for the police to catch up and box in the escaping vehicle, it slammed down, scraping the street and sprinkling the road with sparks. Katsuki flashed his hero license to the police after getting out of the car. As Katsuki nodded, one of the officers remarked, "Thanks a lot, Ground Zero, good thing you were here." He walked away and then bounded off again, saying, "No problem, looks like you've got things handled here, I'm just gonna head out." He hissed, "I'm going to be late." As Katsuki landed in front of him, the number 5 hero, Best Jeanist, stood in front of his office and tapped his foot. The blonde hero raised an eyebrow without saying anything. Katsuki walked past him to go get dressed in his hero suit, shouting, I know I'm late, there was a car chase all right." Katsuki came back wearing his hero suit, which was mostly black with orange trim around the edges, for patrol. He wore a sleeveless summer costume that flaunted his toned arms. The costume's collar fit snugly around his neck. He was wearing gauntlets with a grenade motif, which were more streamlined than the bulky ones he had worn in high school. He wore loose-fitting green pants with metal knee pads that resembled grenades. Katsuki said, "I'm ready." Let's go, and he moved forward. As he walked alongside the young man, Best Jeanist examined him and then nodded. Katsuki stayed aggressively silent as the two walked in silence, only broken by Jeanist greeting people they passed. Jeanist talked to him as they strolled down a largely deserted street. These walks don't just have to be about patrolling our sector, they're also a good chance to just talk. What's bothering you? The expert inquired. Katsuki's crimson eyes ducked to Jeanist and then looked straight ahead once more. Jeanist was about to bring up the subject when Katsuki interrupted. Katsuki stated, I had a dream about an old friend. A friend he lost. The realization caused Jeanist's eyes to lift a little. I'm sorry for your loss, Katsuki yelled. He's not dead, before he realized he was in public and calmed down. Katsuki ran a hand over his head and remarked, at least I think he's not dead. He disappeared 7 years ago. The Best Jeanist remembered his true age as he glanced at his proto-copyright copyright. He had been through a lot and was only 20 years old. There were moments when Jeanist forgot Katsuki was still a child. He asked the younger blonde, who let out a sharp breath between his teeth, what happened? Katsuki claimed, he saved my life and he lost everything because of it, recalling what had happened to Izuku following his murder of the sludge villain. The audience was initially in awe of what they had witnessed, but that soon gave way to censure and criticism. While Izuku was being taken into custody, the heroes who had been present chastised him. Izuku was a civilian who had killed someone using his quirk. He was not a hero. Izuku was a criminal by law. They demanded their pound of flesh, which caused a commotion within the safety commission. An example had to be set, despite Endeavor supporting him and Izuku's father's attorneys battling valiantly. The biggest blow was that Izuku was blacklisted and would not be permitted to attend any hero courses in Japan. He would not be imprisoned, but he would have to meet with the police once a month and have his quirk factor tested to make sure he wasn't using it illegally. Recalling Izuku sitting in the courtroom as the verdict was delivered, Katsuki swallowed hard. With a slam of his hands on the banister, Endeavor exclaimed, "You can't be serious, this boy is a hero. He saved a life with his actions." "That is enough, Endeavor, our decision is final. Mr. Midoriya should be grateful we're not having him locked up," said the judge. "You bastards can't do this, he saved my life," Katsuki yelled, skittering over the railing and heading for the bench, but Izuku grabbed his hand to stop him. "Katsuki, stop!" the boy with the red hair exclaimed, glancing at Katsuki. Izuku's green eyes were staring into Katsuki's as he said, "I accept the punishment. I took someone's life, but I don't regret saving you. I made a choice. I chose that your life was more important than his and I stand by that choice. I won't apologize for saving you. You're my best friend. He saved my life, damn it, and lost everything. Why is it that everyone who helps me gets hurt? Izuku lost his chance to be a hero to save me. All Might died fighting All for One after saving me. I'd say I'm cursed if I actually believed in that shit," Katsuki yelled. Both Jeanists knew it was a half-hearted statement, but the best one said, "Language." The Best Jeanist turned to face his young apprentice. He asked, "What do you think he'd say about the man you've become?" As Katsuki's face twisted and he raised his head to look at Best Jeanist. Best Jeanist sighed and he asked, "What are you talking about?" The Jean hero bombarded Katsuki with questions, demanding an answer. "This friend who you say sacrificed everything for you. What would he say about the person you've become? Do you think he'd be ashamed of who you are? Do you think he'd regret saving your life?" "Of course not," exclaimed Katsuki. "He'd never say that he was my best friend. He'd probably tell me to stop bitching. I know he'd be proud. He'd congratulate me and say how happy he is to know me, then probably say he could have done even better. He always knew how to really get me off my ass." Best Jeanist grinned behind his mask, temporarily ignoring the numerous expletives Katsuki had used. Katsuki rolled his eyes at Best Jeanist, knowing that the hero was merely attempting to keep his mind optimistic, but he didn't mind. "Well, don't stop there, tell me more about this young man. Whether he's dead or not, it doesn't hurt to keep his memory alive." After saying, "All right, you nosy bastard," Katsuki entertained Best Jeanist and the rest of their patrol with tales of Izuku. While Endeavor reviewed agency reports, Shoko stood in his office. "At long last," she said, "we're going to be late." Shoko was wearing a one-piece suit that was patterned in a spiral of white and red. The young woman didn't seem to care that the spiral highlighted her modest bust and curves, which had been noticed on some online ranking boards. Endeavor wrote something down and then got up, saying, "I will not be late. We'll be heading to the ceremony soon enough." As he gazed at his daughter, whose mismatched eyes gazed out the window onto the nighttime cityscape, Endeavor remarked, "Since when are you in such a hurry for these things?" I've been the #1 hero for the past 6 years, it'll be the same thing it always is. She moved to fall in next to him as they made their way to the elevator, explaining, I'm not in a hurry, I just don't want to be late. Endeavor gazed at his daughter's transformation into a heroine. Without Izuku by her side, he had assumed she would be lost. He was still hurt by the boy's disappearance. It was like losing another son. The boy had a promising future as a hero one day, and the next he was a villain who had lost everything. About a month after his sentence was delivered, Izuku vanished. He was aware that Hisashi intended to relocate the Midoriya family to America in order to allow Izuku to pursue his dream, but the boy had vanished earlier. Days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months, as everyone looked for the boy. Everyone eventually had to acknowledge that the boy was either dead or didn't want to be located. In order to leave the nation that had harmed their son, Hisashi eventually relocated to America with his wife. With his head moving swiftly from side to side, Endeavor scoured the city below as he flew across the sky. As he soared through the air, Endeavor snarled, "Where the hell did you go?" He had received a call from Hisashi informing him that Izuku had not gone to his scheduled check-in or returned from school. If the boy didn't show up, the police would be called. Everyone who knew the boy had gone looking for him after that 2-day incident. After landing on a building, Endeavor looked around the city in the vain hope that he would spot a strand of red hair among the crowd. He would have to end the search if he couldn't find him today. All of the symptoms of 3 days gone and no Oniya amounted to something terrible. Endeavor and Shoko stepped in as the elevator dinged, luring him out of his reverie. Shoko had been determined to find the boy from Bakugo, and they had been looking for weeks. She would search every day after school and not come back until long after dark. At moments like those, Shoko demonstrated how much she resembled her mother. She had been a wreck. Rei's weak body made it harder for her to cope with stress. Enji had to stop his daughter at last. The tall man found his daughter wandering the street, still looking for Izuku, and said, "That's enough, Shoko." Enji looked at his daughter, who was leaning against a building and breathing heavily, and said, "It's time to stop." Since Izuku vanished, she had been exhausted and had scarcely slept. She pushed herself off the wall and staggered to regain her balance before continuing, saying, "I have to find him. He's out here somewhere and he needs me." Enji extended his arm and took hold of her shoulder. "Shoko, stop, it's over. Izuku is gone." "No, he's not," she cried, squirming away from her father. "He's not gone. He can't be gone. He said we'd be heroes together, he promised me we'd work together and that we'd have our own agency. Izuku doesn't lie, he wouldn't do that to me, father. Father, father." Endeavor glanced at Shoko, who was standing across from the open elevator door, and jerked. Shoko said, "What are you doing? Come on," as she looked at him with a furrowed brow. Endeavor shook his head and pinched the bridge of his nose as she asked, "What's wrong with you?" He walked past Shoko, but not quickly enough for her to miss the possible tears still in his eyes, and said, "It's nothing, let's go." After tending to her father for a while, she inhaled deeply. She said, "Later." The rest of Japan was huddled around their TVs as Endeavor and Shoko departed for their get-together. In a ceremony reminiscent of the Oscars, Japan announced its top 10 heroes today, and everyone was eager to see where their favorite figures would end up. Heroes arrived in the city from all over the nation to see the results of their laborsa or lack thereof. Best Jeanist went backstage to wait for the ceremony to begin, while Katsuki waited in the lobby. Many heroes walked by him as he stood there, some greeting him and others nodding silently. That is, until Ryukyu and her sidekicks Najire and Ochako showed up. Wearing a pink and black hero suit, the brown-haired girl carried her helmet in one arm. She glanced around the lobby before spotting Bakugo and approached him with a big smile on her face. As she ran up to embrace him, she exclaimed, "Bakugo, it's so good to see you." In exchange, she got multiple pats on the back. As they took a step back, he said, "You too, Uraraka, it's been a while." She combed a lock of honey-brown hair behind her ear and remarked, "It really has. I think the last time was when we stormed that Meta Liberation stronghold a year back." As Bakugo nodded, Uraraka said, "Now that I say that, I can't believe it's only been a year, it feels so much longer. How has Shoko been?" Before turning to face the entrance and spotting another familiar face, he said, "She's good, from what I hear she's supposed to be here today." Katsuki yelled, "Hey, blockhead!" at the young man with the red hair and spikes who was standing next to Fatgum. Kirishima was wearing his hero costume, which included black pants and red and black boots, as well as a sleeveless vest with a red R on the left breast. Katsuki called out to him after he had just taken off a pair of round black shades. "Hey, Katsuki!" he exclaimed as he jogged toward them. He smiled foolishly and said, "How's it going, dude, and hey Uraraka, how y'all been?" When Katsuki first started UA, Kirishima was his best friend. The redhead was incredibly gregarious and unyielding. He couldn't leave well enough alone, and before he knew it, Katsuki, who had only been able to rely on 2 people, was counting on him. As more and more Class A members, including Shoko, began to arrive, he said, "Things have been good. How about you and Fatgum?" Kirishima remarked, "It's pretty much a class reunion here," as the sidekicks entered the stadium to find seats. Katsuki and Shoko were the last 2 people seated, sitting next to one another. Although there were a few surprises, the ceremony proceeded as most had anticipated, with Endeavor continuing to be the top hero. Now, Best Jeanist was in second place, followed by Mirko in third, Ryukyu, and Lemillion in fifth place. Najire gave the loudest cheer when Lemillion was mentioned. The former Class A students congratulated Mirio on his ascension while standing in the lobby following the ceremony. After giving Mirio a cheek kiss, Najire exclaimed, "Hey, let's go celebrate everyone." This plan was greeted with cheers. Kirishima said, "Come on Bakugo, let's go party with the new number 5 hero," but Bakugo simply shook his head. As the girl with the 2-tone hair stood beside him, he said, "Sorry, Eijiro. Shoko and I already made plans. I apologize to all of you. Perhaps next time," Shoko said in a kind and courteous tone. Yaoyorozu said, "Oh, no worries, we should do a whole Class A reunion sometime," as the 2 heroes bid farewell and departed. Both Kirishima and Yaoyorozu shook their heads in response to Hagakuri's question, "Are you sure those 2 aren't dating? I mean, we said they weren't when we were in high school, but maybe they're now?" "No, it's not that. Those 2 got a shared history, they both lost a friend, so they get together and walk down memory lane." Kirishima replied with a nod. When Bakugo had told him about his childhood friend Midoriya, it had been quite a moment. He didn't know how to feel about someone who had killed someone, but he felt bad for the guy who was getting such a raw deal. The idea was simply so alien to him. "I believe Bakugo and Shoko were childhood friends with a young boy who went missing. They like to reminisce about him, I suppose," she said as Sue surveyed the area. As members of well-known hero families, Momo and Shoko grew close in their first year of dating. Momo was rendered speechless when Shoko confided in her the secret of her relationship with Bakugo. She wanted to be an even better friend to Shoko because she couldn't imagine going through what the 2 had. When the assembled sidekicks shook their heads no, Sue said, "Those 2 aren't the only ones missing out. Have any of you seen Iida or Ishido?" Shoko followed Katsuki as he opened the door and entered. The 2 had just walked into a tiny coffee shop late at night. Sitting at a table by the window, they could clearly see their reflections in the darkness outside. Shoko remarked, "A year already," while Katsuki reclined in his seat. Katsuki snarled, "Yep. 7 years now, wherever the hell Izuku is. I hope he's fucking miserable," while Shoko tilted her head to the side. She asked, "You still believe Izuku is alive?" and got a glare in return. A waiter approached their table, and Shoko sighed at Katsuki's combative tone. "Are you saying you don't? You think he's dead too?" she asked. He produced a small notebook and pen and asked, "Can I get you 2 anything?" Shoko put her chat with Katsuki aside and sat back. As their waiter nodded, she said, "I'll have black tea with milk." "And you, sir?" With a curt, "Coffee black," Katsuki said. After giving them a nod, their waiter left. Shoko looked out the window and steepled her fingers. "Back to your question, no, I don't believe Izuku is dead. Whether that's my true conviction or just my fear of losing him without ever knowing it, I can't say," she said. Looking out the window, Katsuki snorted, "I suppose it's just easier to believe he's out there alive and doesn't want to see us than to believe he's dead. I had a dream about him last night. It was the day he saved me from the sludge villain, and then I spent most of the day telling Best Jeanist about him. He asked I didn't want to talk about it, but you know Jeanist, he's a nosy fucker," Katsuki said with a grin. As Katsuki sneered, Shoko teased, "He might have picked Izuku over you. Izuku would definitely have been an easier student to teach." With a shit-eating smile, Katsuki said, "Yeah, right, we both know your dad would have snatched him up. He's practically Endeavor's son, or more like your husband and his son-in-law." In an attempt to prevent her cheeks from turning red, Shoko rolled her eyes. As their drinks were brought over, she said only, "We were never like that." After blowing out her tea, Shoko took a sip. She sighed contentedly as the warmth of the tea passed through her. Katsuki chuckled darkly and sipped his coffee, feeling the bitterness of the beverage wash over his tongue. "Not that you didn't want to be. Izuku was the only one who didn't see how you looked at him all lovey-dovey and shit." He sat the cup down and grunted in satisfaction. Shoko met Katsuki's red eyes and remarked, "It's not like you were much better." Everyone saw how jealous you were that I was taking him away from you, but to be fair, he was mine first. Oh fuck yo. Katsuki's phone rang before he could start yelling. He yelled, "You just hold on." What? Shoko watched as Katsuki listened to the phone, his annoyance disappearing and being replaced by bewilderment. Katsuki questioned, "What? Why do you need me 4 eyes?" "I think he's speaking to Iida." Shoko pondered, with a, "Alright fine, don't piss yourself, I'll be there." Katsuki got up, put his phone back in his pocket, took out his wallet, and tossed some cash on the table. As Shoko spread her hands, Katsuki yelled, "Don't think this is over, smartass. Iida bailed you out this time." Shoko was about to get up when Katsuki waved her away. "What is it? Maybe I should come too," she said. As he left, he said, "I don't need your help, just drink your tea." Shoko saw Katsuki emerge onto the pavement, survey his surroundings, and then burst into the air. Shoko sighed and returned to her tea after watching his flickering explosions fade into the distance. An hour before, seated on a stack of shipping containers at the port's edge, Tenya Iida, better known as the engine hero Ingenium, gazed out at the port while his white armor turned gray in the darkness. Beside the engine hero, a pretty woman with pink skin lay chest down on the container, her fluffy pink hair reaching her waist and blowing in the night. Pinky, whose real name was Mina Ashido, was the acid hero. Ashido removed the binoculars from her eyes, exposing the golden irises and jet black sclera that appeared to glow in the shadows. As Iida tapped the side of his helmet, blocking out his own binocular vision and turning to face Ashido, she said, "Iida, why are we here? You know tonight is the hero ranking ceremony. I bet all our classmates showed up and here we are staking out a port, and for what?" Iida took a knee beside her and said, "Pinky, please use my hero name while we're on duty. And have you heard about the vigilante Ifrit?" After lying on her stomach, Ashido sat up and rolled her eyes at Iida. Iida still hadn't been able to get the stick out of his ass after all these years after high school. Ashido said, "Fine, whatever, pronouncing his full name. "And yeah, sure, I've heard of something like that. A fire vigilante, some people say he's a demon of fire or some crap. Is that why we're here, to take down some vigilante? Not to undermine the importance of stopping vigilantism, but we've got so much more going on, Iida. Organized crime is on the rise, the meta liberation is still skulking around. I think we can afford to let vigilantes slide until we deal with the bigger threats." It was well known that the public had lost some faith in its heroes ever since All Might's passing. After all, what did it say about everyone else who wasn't as strong if the most powerful hero could be killed? As a result, many citizens took up arms and used their peculiarities to protect themselves. Iida remarked, "This isn't your average vigilante, Pinky," as she turned to face the port. Iida went on, "He's killing villains, specifically Yakuza." Iida recounted his anger when he confronted the hero killer, saying, "You know my history with the hero killer. I went out to kill him for what he did to my brother. I wasn't acting like a hero. It took Bakugo and Todoroki to show me the error of my ways. I didn't handle the stain situation correctly. This is my chance to do things the right way." Before returning to the true reason he felt compelled to take action, Iida stated, "There's supposed to be a drop-off for the Gozo family here tonight. The Gozo family has been Ifrit's target for the last few weeks, so if they're here, chances are he will be here too, and even if he's not, we'll take these scum down and confiscate whatever they're having brought into Japan. Maybe this person was wronged by a villain, or maybe they think what we heroes do isn't enough anymore. Either way, I think I can empathize with this person and show them the error of their ways by taking them down." Ashido smiled as he looked at Iida. She exclaimed, "Okay, Ingenium, you've persuaded me. Let's do this," as she watched a number of vehicles begin to arrive at the port. "Oh, looks like the party is about to start," Ashido remarked as she squatted and grabbed her binoculars. Senji, the Gozo family's Yakuza boss, emerged from the rear of the vehicle wearing a scowl. "I can't believe I have to handle this shit in person," he screamed. Ifrit, that fucking vigilante, had been harassing his people for the past month. That jerk was most likely a mutant freak with an axe to grind, but he wouldn't call him a monster. He had been gradually destroying his organization by murdering his men, and those he spared were reduced to sobbing messies who were yelling about a demon. As he approached a shipping container, he said, "Let's see that fucker do something with all these guys here." For this pickup, Senji had organized 24 men, fully armed and prepared to take a life. A large group of young men and women were crammed into the container like sardines when 2 of his men opened the doors. Senji was about to say, "All right, you know the drill, load them up and take them to the drop-off point," when a green light flared into life behind him. The people in the container cowered as his shadow fell over them. He turned to see where the light was coming from. A creature crouched on the side of a shipping container. As though the fire were its skin, the bones of its hands were visible through the flames that encased its arms from the elbow down. From the knee down, its legs were identical. It would be careless to describe the creature's hide as skin because it was covered in glowing green fire cracks that ran the length of its body. The head was much more unsettling. It had bared its teeth in what could be loosely described as an overly large smile where its mouth should have been. Periodically, flames erupted from the sides of its mouth, illuminating the remainder of its face. From above its mouth, only 2 points of glowing green were visible. There was a mane of flame drifting languidly through the night air where hair should have been. Monster," muttered Senji. Having witnessed the green fire's light emerge, Iida had acted immediately. He yelled, "Pinky," as he ran across the shipping containers to the port's dock. "Right behind you," Ashido exclaimed, trailing Iida as they both started to approach the green flame. Before slashing like a furious viper, the creature squatted there for a while, its flame hair flowing lazily. That was the cue to start the carnage. The beast abruptly vanished from view, only to reappear in front of a Yakuza thugs. A flaming fist filled his entire field of vision. Ifrit struck the thug, causing his victim to be flung backward onto the ground, clawing at his face as his head caught fire. As he screamed, his skin was sizzling and he was inhaling fiery breaths that burned his vocal cords and lungs until his screams turned into terrible whimpers and eventually to silence. The thugs were enraged by this act of aggression, and some of them pulled guns while others used their quirks. As the thugs performed their duty and formed a wall to protect Senji, bullets, blades, and beams of light were directed at the creature that started to run around the increasingly condensed circle. It was propelled swiftly by jet-like flames as sparks flew from its feet as they struck the ground. After abruptly stopping, it charged directly at the group, avoiding the approaching projectiles, then leapt forward and struck one of the Yakuza in the stomach before setting its foot on fire. When a stream of flame erupted from the unfortunate thug's back, those who had been closest to him saw his back start to glow before diving to the side. The Ifrit was in front of them as the thugs dispersed and peered through the blackened hole in their comrade's stomach before he fell to the ground. The intensity of its green flames is even higher. When Iida first arrived, she saw the Yakuza group attempting to gather themselves from the ground while those who were unlucky or too slow to escape rolled around attempting to extinguish the flames that were consuming them. His gaze shifted from them to one of the two surviving figures. The first was Senji Ingenium, the Yakuza leader who was identified in his records as the Gozo family's crime boss, and the second was his actual target. Ifrit. The burning entity stood before the recuperating Yakuza, then crouched and threw back its fist as though it were going to punch someone. A flame gathered around the fist, then grew steadily smaller. When Ashido arrived, she recognized a wind-up because of her experience in both close quarters and long-range combat. She was too late when she hurried past Iida with a huge gob of acid ready to be thrown. Immolation Fist. Before it delivered its punch, the gruff voice was lost in the roaring flames encircling its body. Ifrit's fist erupted into a wall of flame that was twice as tall and multiple times as wide as the typical person. The Yakuza never had a chance to recover. Even their screams could not be heard because they were so thoroughly consumed by the flames. Beyond them, the fire continued to burn, melting the rail before crashing into the ocean and releasing a cloud of steam that engulfed the entire port. Ashido stood staring at the green glow glinting through the mist, acid dripping from between her fingers. Perhaps she didn't want the smell of burning flesh to linger in her nostrils any longer, or she didn't want to breathe in too much of the blazing air. Before concentrating on the green glow approaching him, Senji glanced around his eyes, wandering in their sockets. Before he ran out of space to retreat, he whimpered and took a steady step back from the glow. He shrieked like a scared child as his back struck the rail. He pivoted, gazing down at the murky swirling water. Shall I leap for it? Before hearing the crunch of a footstep directly behind him, he asked himself. Even though he didn't want to, he found himself slowly turning and facing the Ifrit as though his body were moving on its own. He was unable to determine whether this creature was human, even up close. Senji begged, "Look, I surrender, please don't kill M." But his plea was cut off when a powerful grip grabbed his face and lifted him into the air. Despite the uncomfortable warmth of the hand holding him, he was more than content to be uncomfortable given what he had witnessed these hands do. Senji gazed down at those green embers that were glowing. Those green embers dug into Ifrit's own eyes as he gazed at him. He had anticipated seeing rage, hatred, or perhaps a sick sense of fulfillment, but instead he saw a ruthless resolve. At that moment, he realized that this thing would kill him at all costs. Burn. The tone was low, but the meaning was obvious. Senji felt pain, and his eyes grew wide. As Ifrit's hand flared to life, burning the man's face as he screamed in agony, heat erupted across his face. As the fog started to clear, Ashido noticed the green glow fading and heard a spine-tingling scream. It rubbed against her bone marrow, irritating her eardrums and making her do something. Before jumping into the air and slamming her leg into Ifrit's side, she ran forward and saw Ifrit in the distance. The fog cleared, revealing what was happening, and she ran even faster for it. The force of the impact makes her grit her teeth. It wasn't immobile, but it was as solid as stone. She launched the creature into the air, causing him to release Senji, who collapsed to the ground, whimpering. Ifrit had to back up to avoid the acid globs she threw after that. After dodging the most recent of Ashido's blows, Ifrit slid across the floor before slamming his hands into the ground to halt his progress. Instinctively, he blasted himself into a barrel roll to the side as he heard the rev of an engine, narrowly avoiding Ingenium's axe kick that would have slammed his face into the pavement. He landed upright, but Ingenium's engine-powered roundhouse was right on his tail. When Ingenium kicked him for the first time, Ifrit raised its arms like a boxer's guard, but more and more kicked him after that. After a barrage of helicopter kicks pounded his arms, Ifrit lost patience and erupted in flames, forcing Ingenium to retreat before Ashido's yell could be heard. Ashido watched Iida use a barrage of kicks to keep the Ifrit pinned down while hammering away at him. She felt something grab her calf, but she was too preoccupied with the fight to notice the Yakuza on the ground behind her. Unable to control her shock, she looked down and yelled in a panic. She would never forget what she saw. Senji had a horribly deformed face. His eyelids appeared to have fused together, and one of his eyes was melted shut. On Senji's forehead, where the flesh had been burned away, she could see charred, exposed bone and a good chunk of his hair. Furrows of charred flesh were visible where Ifrit's fingers had encircled his face. Ashido was aware that if Rit had left its mark, these burns would most likely never heal. After each apology, Ashido saw the man repeatedly press his face against her boot, saying, "D don't let me D die. P place please S save me. I'm sorry." Ashido realized the man was actually kissing her boot and pleading with her to save him. Ashido's indifference to villains vanished when she saw this pathetic scene. Although villains should receive punishment, this was excessive. Looking across the battle-scarred port, Ashido saw piles of ash where people had once lived. The landscape spoke for itself. What had occurred here was an extermination, not a case of justice. Ingenium had retreated from Ifrit's assault, but he made the error of turning away when he heard Ashido scream. As soon as he turned his head away, Ifrit charged at Ashido, his hands and feet blazing with fire, sending him flying in the direction of Ashido and his intended victim, Senji. Although he knew he wouldn't make it in time, Ingenium squatted, turned on his recipro, and ran as hard as he could, forcing his engines to thrust harder and his legs to move more quickly. Pinky. When Iida yelled, Ashido spun around and saw the flaming beast flying directly at her. She didn't waste any time in generating acid throughout her body. It served as defense against Ifrit's fire. She threw a punch covered in acid, not sure if it would work, but hoping it would keep his flames at bay. With practiced accuracy, Ifrit stepped aside and seized Ashido's wrist. Then, he rotated his hand around the girl and threw her away, blazing flames from it. The acid on her body caused Ashido to lose his hold and send her flying, even though he was certain he intended to slam her into the ground. Once more, Ifrit's final move was cut short as he turned to face Senji, thrusting down towards him while straightening his fingers like a burning knife. His move on Ashido had given Ingenium enough time to catch up and kick Ifrit in the side of the head, knocking the creature away and sending it spinning like a cartwheel through the air before slamming into the railing of the port. Iida would never again make the same error. He followed after Ifrit and went for another kick, but as he closed in, Ifrit turned to him and held out its hands from which spewed small lights that looked like fireflies, Ifrit said, while turning to face Iida. Iida could see blood running down its mouth and behind that tooth's pale white skin, where one of its teeth had been cracked by his kick and bent inward. He only saw that before the first firefly burst into brilliant light, setting off a series of events that included them all. Light poured into the port. Iida lowered his helmet's visor to see through the glaring light, but it was useless. All he could see was a green light that grew steadily dimmer as it got farther away. Ifrit had gotten away. When Katsuki emerged onto the port proper from the tangle of shipping containers, he was astounded by what he saw. The port was marked by a huge scorch mark that led to a puddle of melted metal that had cooled long ago. Ash heaps scattered throughout the port were being shoveled or slid into body bags, which indicated to Katsuki that people had once lived there. Police and emergency personnel were crossing the port, and as he approached, he could hear some conversation amongst them. Damn, I need a dustpan to collect this guy. I'm not even sure if there are even any teeth to find a dental record. How hot does a fire have to be to do this? When Katsuki eventually saw Iida, he approached him. Ashido was on the ground, nursing a bottle of water, and he stood beside her. Under his arm, the engine hero's helmet revealed his hair, which had been dried out and matted to his head. Attracting the attention of the two heroes, Katsuki exclaimed, "What the hell happened here? It looks like a goddamn war zone." Iida's dark blue eyes were fixed on the blonde as he said, "Oh, Bakugo, you're here. I need to ask you something. Have you ever trained any of Best Jeanist's new sidekicks or anyone else for that matter? Maybe mentored a hero course student?" As Iida produced a tablet and took a USB cord from under his armor's wrist and plugged it in, Katsuki finally questioned, "What? No, Jeanist doesn't really let me near the new recruits. I haven't mentored anyone either. What's this about 4 eyes?" He played a video and said, "I want you to see this." The battle was captured on tape from Iida's perspective. Bakugo was interested in the fight and had already made some assumptions. As the final phase of the fight unfolded, Bakugo remarked, "Whoever they are, they're skilled. These moves aren't just something you pick up. They have to be taught and practiced." Iida could see the full extent of Ifrit's maneuver from his perspective. Iida said, "Look familiar?" and Bakugo arched his brow in response. Iida sighed, and Katsuki questioned, "What is Shido getting tossed? What's so special about that?" Ashido waved her hand languidly at Bakugo, who scowled, and said, "I told you he wouldn't notice it. Zoom in and play it back." When Ashido said, "All right here, watch carefully," Iida followed his instructions and repeated the maneuver. As if lightning struck, Katsuki became intensely focused on it, trying to figure out what the hell they were talking about. As Ashido moaned and Iida nodded, he remarked, "I've done that move before." Ashido remarked, "That's an understatement." Iida shows him the compilation. Iida had already loaded a YouTube video in a minimized window. Ground Zero's TN Toss compilation was the title. "What on earth is a TN Toss?" he yelled, causing Ashido to snort. Iida started playing the video as Bakugo threw villains like Ifrit on the screen while opera music played over it, and then she pulled up the battle with Ifrit so the maneuvers could be seen side by side. That's what your fans call it, though some like to call it the Dynamite Slam. There are a few minor variations, but the parallels are too great for this to be someone who simply watched videos of you and copied your method. Someone who knows you or has witnessed that move up close had to be the one. Iida's voice was a dull hum as Bakugo was pulled into his own recollection. "That's why I asked if you had trained someone." Bakugo's eyes had taken on a distant look as he watched the two videos play side by side. "Hey, Izuku, take a look." A young Katsuki threw out his hand backward and set off a series of tiny explosions that gradually increased the merry-go-round's speed after running past a little red-haired boy and jumping onto it. Izuku was taking some notes in his notebook when Katsuki leapt off the merry-go-round and approached him. "Cool, Katsuki, you know you could probably use that as an attack if you made your explosions more powerful." "You mean something like this?" Izuku's hand was grabbed by Katsuki, who then spun around him with his explosions, but they were insufficiently strong and ultimately caused Katsuki to trip. Izuku laughed and said, "I told you to do it when your explosions are stronger, dummy." An older Katsuki stood over Izuku and slammed him to the ground, saying, "Whose explosions are too weak now, Izuku?" As an older Izuku got up and brushed himself off, Katsuki sneered down at him. Izuku replied, Yeah, just remember who gave you that idea, Katsuki, and who helped you build it up," before circling Katsuki and almost pulling off the same move, but lacking his rival's explosive power. "It's harder for me to do it because I don't have the explosive propulsion, but maybe if I use my fire as jets," Izuku said, his voice starting to turn into a mutterstorm, before Katsuki struck him in the arm. Izuku shoved Katsuki after he teased, "Quit it, you're being weird again, and doesn't matter how hard you work, you'll never do that move as well as me, Izuku." "Yeah, you're right, I'll do it better," Izuku grinned broadly. "Are you listening, Bakugo?" Iida said, drawing Katsuki's attention to the hero with the blue hair. Iida moaned and then repeated, "What were you saying I was focusing?" Katsuki asked. "I stated that I would begin talking to other heroes about creating a task force to address this, Ifrit. This vigilante isn't your typical one. He might even be worse than the hero killer. I hoped you could talk to Best Jeanist and perhaps contact Todoroki regarding joining Endeavor." "No," as Ashido raised an eyebrow and Iida's brows furrowed, Katsuki yelled, startling the two heroes with his voice before coughing. "I mean no, We shouldn't get Endeavor involved with this, Katsuki said. Why shouldn't we? What? Bakugo stepped back, unsure of how to get Iida to drop this, but he knew he couldn't let Shoko know about it. He's the #1 hero, Iida said. Indeed, he is the most popular hero, so everyone in Japan is watching. Everyone is aware of Endeavor's location or his future plans. What would happen if this vigilante found out that Endeavor is pursuing him? If he knew where Endeavor wasn't, he could go underground or worse. This task force needs to be small. Iida glanced at Bakugo for a moment before nodding. I say me, you, and heroes who specialize in capture, maybe Mudman Best Jeanist or even Eraserhead. A small team would work best, you're right. You'll talk to Best Jeanist, I suppose, and I'll contact Aizawa. Bakugo gave a nod. Bakugo emphasized the point before turning around and leaving, saying, sure thing, we should probably not tell Shoko either if the public sees Endeavor without his sidekick that could make people suspicious. After watching Bakugo go, Ashido turned to face Iida and asked, did you think he was tense? Iida was in the middle of calling Aizawa when he looked up from his phone. Obviously, he is Ashido. There is a highly skilled combatant and murderer on the loose. All of us ought to be on edge. Now that he's killing villains, who knows when that won't be enough and he becomes the next Stain? Ashido scowled as he turned to face Bakugo, who had vanished. Sure, I hope that's all that's going on, she replied. He gasped as he leaned against a shipping container, his mind racing and his heart thumping, once he was out of sight of Ashido and Iida. There is no way that it could be. He would never do this. It must be someone else. It's a mistake. It couldn't possibly be. Izuku? In the early morning light, a green light streaked across the sky above a small town in the countryside near Tokyo, then fell into the thick woods, Ifrit stumbling on the ground before landing on the porch of a small shrine. The beast muttering as it picked itself up, slid the door open, and staggered inside, the shrine small and shabby, having not had a visitor for what must have been decades, and Ifrit stood in the darkness as its flames guttered out. When the Ifrit's skin was shed, a shaggy red-haired youth emerged, his red hair once a mane of green flamessa falling around his head in thick red curls that shadowed his eyes as he removed the rest of his suit. The hands that had once been wreathed in flames revealed normal human arms that were slightly pink from the flames. The hands were covered in fingerless gloves that were summarily slid off, and as it reached towards its mouth, there was a click from the back of its head and a low groan as the mask was removed. Lastly, the hood on its head was thrown back, and the transformation was complete. With a heavy thud, the young man fell to the wooden floor of the shrine and removed the portianki covering his feet. The Ifrit's hide was a combat outfit with flows across it for the flames he produced, creating the green lines of flames across his body. He had gotten the idea from Endeavor's suit, where the shoulders and back were roiling flames, allowing more area for heat to be dispersed. After shedding all of his skin, the young man, wearing only a pair of briefs, left the shrine and proceeded to a nearby river, where he waded waist deep and gazed at Izuku Midoriya's reflection. He hissed as he applied pressure to the wound on his cheek and discovered that a metal shard had completely pierced it. Damn it. Before bringing a handful above his head and letting it fall upon him like a purifying rain, he said, washing his hands in the river. The main idea behind his quirk was that he rinsed himself, but more than that, it lowered his body temperature. The doctors had named it a heat sink. Izuku could absorb ambient heat and use it to create fire, of course, and he could do the same with his own body heat and get the same effect, but doing so would cause him to gradually drop in body temperature, which would put him into hypothermia if he pushed it too far. On the other hand, he could only absorb so much heat before his body started to press into hyperthermia and begin cooking itself. The water hitting his body started to steam a little as he felt himself cool. I didn't anticipate seeing Pinky and Ingenium. Did they also have the Gozo family on their radar, or was it a coincidence? He asked himself. That's nonsense, you know. They supported you. They came for you. Didn't you hear Ingenium shout your name? Izuku bit his lip as he gazed down at the stream's flow and saw the Ifrit's reflection staring back. Izuku vaguely recalled hearing Ingenium yell at him, but he hadn't given it much thought because he had been hunting down villains for years and, on the rare occasions when a hero did come across him, he was able to escape with little difficulty. However, those two had come at him with the intention of stopping him. At the very least, they weren't going to allow him to kill Senji for his human trafficking, and at the most, they were there to capture him. After this, they won't let you leave. They will pursue you. The next time they pursue you, what will you do? The mission isn't finished yet, so you can't let them catch you. Izuku took a deep breath and let it out harshly. I'll figure out how to escape. With laughter echoing in his mind, Izuku remarked, they were just lucky this time. I'll be more careful next time. That will not work, and you will need to fight. But can you? We have never before engaged in a serious battle with a hero. Indeed, there are countless dead villains, but what will you do, heroes, true heroes? Izuku snarled as a stream of flame crashed onto the river's surface. As his chest heaved under the strain, he muttered, I'll figure something out. I won't kill heroes, that's one line I will. No cross. Glaring at the giggling Ifrit in the water, he said. You will then be accepted, and all of your hard work will come to an end. Do you want it that way? Before Izuku's eyes turned green, Ifrit posed the query. No. Izuku walked out of the river back to the shrine, slamming the door and falling onto a futon and wrapping himself in a blanket before he fell into a deep sleep. He shouted, breathing out a flame that boiled the water but succeeded in dispersing the image of the Ifrit. With his laptop open, Katsuki sat in his apartment and saw that his research had led him back several years to the vigilante Ifrit, who had become active shortly after All Might was first spotted in Kamino. With his hero clearance, he was able to pull up police records from that period and was shocked to discover that this Ifrit was the reason why several members of the League of Villains were now dead, or at the very least, that he was the one who killed Mr. Compress, Spinner, Muscular, and Magna. Along with Shigaraki, Himiko Toga and Twice had been apprehended. Dabi, the only League member who had not been seen, was presumed dead and simply had not been located. Katsuki played a video that was the first time the Ifrit had been spotted, captured by an ATM camera. A salaryman approached the ATM, took out some cash, and as soon as the money was in his hand, a masked individual with big rock hands approached from behind and struck him over the head. The salaryman collapsed to the ground as two more masked men appeared, and the three of them started stomping the poor man. Katsuki clenched his teeth before a fireball struck the rock hand thug in the face, knocking him back, and a flaming figure appeared, slamming a knee into the back of one thug's head before punching the final one in the face, sending him flying into the street. The video was sadly lacking in audio, so Katsuki had to guess what he had done until Ifrit reappeared. The street thug was trying to get up and flee while clutching his burned face, but Ifrit kicked his legs out from under him and then kicked him in the side, causing him to roll onto his back. Ifrit then dropped to its knees, straddling the man's chest, and tore off the now burned mask. The thug waved his hands in an attempt to hit him or knock him off, but Ifrit slapped his hands to the side and repeatedly punched him in the face with flaming fists, causing sounds Katsuki could only imagine. After making sure the thug was well and truly dead, Ifrit walked over to the salaryman on the ground in front of the ATM. The Ifrit kneeled down out of shot for several moments before standing up and dashing off. The video ended with a still frame of a blurry Ifrit escaping. Katsuki rubbed his forehead as he looked at the screen. Reading the corresponding crime report, the police had been called from the salaryman's phone, but the man was unconscious during the time the call was made, so it was assumed that Ifrit made the call. None of the images he found of Ifrit were all that great, even the higher resolution ones couldn't seem to deal with the heat and fire it produced, causing the image to always be hazy. Katsuki judged Ifrit to be around the same height as himself, 5'9" to 5'10". It was hard to tell, but by the maneuvers he performed and the few feats of strength that could be found, he was sure he wasn't exceptionally strong. That wasn't a lot to go on though, and it didn't confirm or deny whether this thing was Izuku or not. Katsuki was thinking about Ifrit's real identity when he heard a knock on his door. He moaned, got up, and walked to his front door on numb legs. When he opened it, daylight almost blinded him. "Aw fuck," he cursed, covering his eyes. Katsuki had come straight home from speaking with Iida last night and had been doing research ever since. He had assumed it had only been a few hours at most, but the daylight lancing through his eyes let him know he was wrong. As his eyes adjusted, Katsuki looked to see Eijiro standing there. "What are you doing here?" Kirishima rolled his eyes as he asked. "Yes, good morning to you as well. May I enter?" As Katsuki stepped back to let him in and thankfully closed off the dazzling daylight, the redhead asked, and Kirishima sighed as she met Katsuki's bloodshot eyes. "Did you stay up late with this Ifrit guy?" As Katsuki growled his response, Kirishima inquired, already knowing the answer. "What if I did? He's killing people out there, and Iida is furious about it." As Kirishima sat in front of Katsuki's laptop, he walked into the kitchen and started browsing through each tab, finding only videos and articles about Ifrit. "Besides, I have nowhere to be," Katsuki said, rubbing his eyes, which he had only just realized were tired of staring at a laptop for hours on end. "This is coming at you quite forcefully." Katsuki rounded the corner of his kitchen with 2 cups and placed one down in front of Eijiro. "I'm surprised you'd come to Iida's aid like this instead of just brushing him off or saying you'll get to it later." Not seeing Kirishima roll his eyes, Katsuki sat on the other end of the couch and retorted, "Way to call me an asshole without calling me an asshole, you dick. Unless you're me, you're not the first person people think to call when they need assistance," I said. "In any case, I wasn't there to discuss your amazing personality." Mina requested that I stop by. The events of last night truly rocked her. Since All Might's death, we've all witnessed a lot of crap, but that truly affected her. As he sipped the water from his cup, Eijiro leaned back on Katsuki's couch and said, "She just thought I should talk to you to see if you were good." "I'm fine, but I'm not as soft as your girlfriend," Katsuki said, swallowing a gulp of water, before meeting Eijiro's gaze and tilting his head to the side. "Want to give that another go without all the bullshit? Are you going to let me know when something is eating?" "I've known you long enough, Katsuki, to know," Eijiro asked, and Katsuki gritted his teeth. He couldn't tell Kirishima what was wrong, that he thought his childhood best friend who vanished might be out there killing criminals and villains. He didn't want to speak that into existence because he didn't know how, but he knew it would get back to Shoko, and he couldn't let that happen. Katsuki knew how Shoko would react if she even considered the possibility that Ifrit was Izuku, and she would do whatever it took to find him, and he couldn't even consider which option was worse. The alternative was that it was Izuku and she would have to accept the fact that he was a murderer. Even if they were villains, he had killed them, and based on the carnage that had occurred on the port, he was very effective at it. If it hadn't been Izuku under those flames, she would have been walking into the path of a murderer and crippling herself to avoid hurting her childhood friend and crush, though she would never admit the second part. Realizing he needed to say something, Katsuki glanced up at Kirishima and said, "Well, look, Izuku has been on my mind a lot lately. I can usually ignore it or put it aside, but this time it's more difficult to move past. All I need is some time to work through my emotions and something to do." Katsuki gave a half lie, saying, "That's why I'm so dialed in on this." Katsuki was thinking about Izuku more frequently, and he wasn't going to be able to get him out of his head anytime soon with this possible trail he had thrown in his lap. After a moment of staring at Katsuki, looking for any sign of dishonesty, Eijiro backed off when Katsuki mentioned Izuku because he knew the boy was a sensitive subject and didn't want to go too far and rip open an old wound. He got up and drained the cup of water, saying, "Okay, man, if you say so, but I'm going to be joining this task force of yours in Mina's stead. Just know I'm here for you, man," he said, passing Bakugo and placing a hand on his shoulder. "I can handle fire pretty well, so I'll have your back." After listening to the door close, Katsuki leaned back on the opposite end of his couch and muttered, "That's the problem, blockhead." He was planning to sleep, and when he woke up, he would talk to Best Jeanist about Ida's task force and inform him that he would be spending some time in Camino. A young man sat in a bright room behind a polished large oak desk in a large manor. The room was decorated with several potted plants and ink paintings. Two couches sat opposite each other on the left and right of the room, separated by a low coffee table. And the symbol of an 8-pointed flower hung on the wall directly behind the young man. This was the symbol of the Shi Hasaikai Yakuza family, led by the young head Kai Chisaki, known in the underworld as Overhaul, who had dark brown hair, light tanned skin, and piercing yellow eyes. Overhaul wore a pressed white dress shirt and crisp slacks. His hands were adorned with pure white gloves, but the most startling aspect of his appearance was the large mask he wore on his face that resembled a bird's beak. There was a knock on Overhaul's door as he sat there staring at the big flat screen on the other side of the room. "Enter," he said, and a man with white hair that resembled arrow-shaped clock needles entered through the door. He was wearing a white coat that covered him from neck to shins with the hood down. "What is chronostasis?" As he watched a port with police and heroes scuttling around it on the flat screen, Overhaul inquired. The chronostasis began his report after noticing what he was seeing. "The Gozo family is no longer there, as you can see. Almost to the last man, Ifrit destroyed them. Senji was the only one who had survived the port. His face was badly burned and he was taken to the hospital. We'll send a cleaner to get rid of him with your consent." Overhaul's gaze eventually shifted from the screen to the man with the white hair. "Whatever became of the product?" The chronostasis bowed his head and asked. There was a crack as the armrest beneath Overhaul's arm broke, and he said, "They were all taken into police custody." As his right-hand man bowed low and backed out the door, he gave the order, "Get out, and make sure the cleaner is extra thorough." After the door closed, Overhaul pressed a number of keys on the computer in front of him, and a ringing sound started from the machine before abruptly stopping. "Hello." Overhaul's computer's speaker emitted the sound of an elderly male voice. "We have a problem, Destro. My organization is being tampered with by a vigilante. Last night, he eliminated my remaining branch families. Kai explained the situation to his partner, who hummed softly on the other end of the phone, saying, if he continues, he's going to impede both our prospects going forward. I'm sorry, but what are you asking me to do? To take him out, would you like additional support equipment? Kai shook his head in response to Destro's question. No, I need him handled by your people. I'd let my people handle it, but given the most recent report, I'll need everyone on board. In addition, your group is bigger than mine and has a more varied fan base. Have them take care of this. I know you have some heroes on your payroll. There was a brief period of silence on the other end. All right, I'll figure this out, but I'll need some trigger. Destro stated his requirements for taking on this troublesome matter. I'd rather have an ace in the hole if this vigilante is causing your people problems. Fine, once you've set things in motion I'll have several cases of trigger delivered, but not a second sooner, Overhaul replied. Think of it as finished. I'll be in contact. Overhaul's computer rang once before a voice spoke, and then the line died and he began typing again. The voice of an older man, whose rasp could be heard even over electronics, said, What is it, Overhaul? You're interrupting my work. Overhaul paused to gather his thoughts before saying something unintelligible. There was a problem with the test subjects, Doctor. The branch I had in charge of the ports has fallen, and they have been taken into custody. Before posing the most crucial query, Overhaul stated, I don't see any overseas subjects coming anytime soon. Is there any way you could carry on with more domestic fodder? Through the speakers, he heard a sigh. I'm sorry to hear that, Shisaki. A few years ago, I had to stop using Japanese people. Overhaul had expected the doctor to complain more, but he accepted the new terms of their arrangement rather easily. How long do you think it will be before you can resume international shipping? I requested overseas merchandise because the heroes and police were closing in on me, but if that is no longer available to me, then I suppose I could resume using local resources. As Overhaul rubbed his forehead, the doctor inquired. I am unable to say. After this most recent setback, I must first increase our numbers before finding a devoted individual to take over the company and train them in its operations. With Senji gone, Shisaki's inner workings were well and truly exposed, and there was no more fodder to throw into the incinerator, so to speak. Ifrit had been a problem for a few years, and in the beginning, Overhaul simply thought he was a nuisance, but gradually he wiped out one family after the other, sometimes purging an entire branch overnight. For this reason, Overhaul had to outsource to Destro and his Meta Liberation Group. Before the line died, he said, Very well, keep me posted. Overhaul leaned back in his chair and massaged his temples. He swore, fucking vigilante. A slender man with a receding hairline, who had disconnected from Overhaul Destro, turned to face a sullen man with a laptop, his black hair hanging down in front of his face, almost covering it. Can you find this, Ifrit skeptic? After hearing several keystrokes, Destro inquired. A search algorithm is already being compiled by me. Skeptic answered Destro's question. I'm sure we'll know where he is in no more than 2 days. After that, put together a squad you believe will be most effective in taking down this vigilante. Have one of our hero supporters locate the body after it's finished and claim credit. I'll see to it that Curious handles the news coverage. As Skeptic bowed, Destro uttered, I want this to be resolved as neatly as possible. As you wish. Izuku opened his eyes slowly, looked around, and then he sat up. He moaned as he felt the pain in his body, yawned loudly, and then growled in agony as he remembered the hole in his cheek. Right, I need to take care of that, he said, reaching to the foot of his bed, and taking out a first aid kit. All right. He whispered, then set his finger on fire and reached into his mouth to seal the inner portion of the hole shut. Izuku clenched his teeth and pulled out his finger before applying antibacterial gel to the outside of his cheek. Okay. Now that that's done. He finished by applying a large band-aid to his cheek and stood up to look around. He had lived in this small shrine for the previous 5 years. He walked to the back wall where an evidence board had been built, and at the outer edge of the board were a number of pictures that led back to a single boss that would connect to the inner edge of the board and from there to the very center. Izuku pressed a heated finger to the image of Senji, the head of the Gozo family. I finally got through the outer ranks. He whispered as he saw the 8 other scorched pictures, each of which had been a small family head that he had taken out in the previous 5 years. The paper burned away at his touch, joining dozens of other burned out images. Izuku shook his head and looked at his suit. Now we start again, Ifrit whispered as he looked at the inner circle of the board, which was the inner circle of the Shi Hasaikai, made up of 3 underbosses each, who had been in charge of 3 of the 9 small-time families. He had no idea who these underbosses could be at the moment. He said, Not yet, I need to have my mask repaired. He picked up his suit and the broken mask and walked away from the board, saying, I guess I'll have to go see Granny. Izuku walked over to a pile of clothes and, after finding a pair of pants and a shirt that fit him well enough, he rifled through a pile of briefcases, wallets, and bags, gathering anything valuable from them. Izuku didn't like stealing, but he needed the money from the Yakuza to carry out his mission. Izuku packed his valuables into a backpack and left the shrine, shielding his eyes from the sun but enjoying the warmth on his body. He was certain that this was all in his head, but he felt as though he had been sleeping most of the morning away, so he threw up his hood as he got closer to the edge of the town, which was bustling with activity. It was probably around 2 in the afternoon now, and the townspeople gave him strange looks as he passed, but he had done this trek enough times that they were no longer genuinely suspicious of him. He was certain that they simply saw him as one of the oddities of the village, the hermit who lived in the woods. Izuku halted in front of a modest house and proceeded down the side to the rear, where a much larger garage was located. He approached the door and silently slid it open before entering. No lights were on in the house until he flipped a switch that showed the tiny figure of an elderly woman sitting at a work table and holding a torch to a piece of metal. "Oh, Ash, are you back?" Izuku had never asked for his name and had never given it, but she needed a name, and since he smelled like ash to her sensitive nose, she called him that. Her husky voice reached out to him, making Izuku laugh. The elderly woman, whose silver hair was styled in a long braid and who was wearing a worker's jumpsuit with thick gloves on her hands, chuckled as he walked forward and said, "I see your echolocation is still working, Granny." She was sitting on a stool that left her feet hanging far above the floor while she worked. "Enough of the small talk, but even without that, I could smell your smoky scent anywhere. Show me what you've done now," she said, holding out her gloved hand to Izuku, who hung his head as he rounded the right side of the elderly woman and put his mask in her hand. She looked up from her work to show Izuku her milky white eyes, and her unusual echolocation more than compensated for her blindness. She was known as Bad Granny or Granny B by most in the town. "You got yourself into something crazy this time, haven't you?" Granny said, removing one of her gloves and running her bony fingers along his mask while whistling softly. Izuku rubbed his head and she said, "Whoever they were, gave you one hell of a kick." She protruded the spike covered in dried blood. "I apologize for that, but tell me how you knew it was a kick." Granny grinned as he asked. "I was producing support equipment prior to the likely birth of your father, boy. When I see battle damage, I know what causes it. That being said, they must have done this to surprise you. Do you feel rusty?" The elderly woman made fun of him. Izuku sighed, ashamed that he had been hit so hard. His master would have slapped him across the head for having such tunnel vision. Granny snorted when he said, "Maybe, again sorry for breaking it. It was time to give your suit a makeover, so what happened to the rest of it?" Izuku held the suit to his chest as she asked. Izuku tried to stop the elderly woman from helping him further, saying, "You don't have to do that, you can just fix the mask and I'll be okay." Granny B whirled from the table and glared at him with her sightless eyes. Having her take care of his mask was bad enough, but even without it, he could still go out, but if she went to work on his entire suit, there was no way he could continue his work well. "Please give me the damn suit. I owe you for saving my life, and fixing your equipment is the least I can do." Granny B shook her head, looked at the suit and mask, and said, "You should have returned sooner. This definitely needs work." Izuku sighed as he handed over the remainder of his suit after shouting and holding out her hand. "This will take some time, but I understand how you feel about not going out and letting the world's problems go unchecked." Granny turned to her desk and rubbed her fingers over the suit, saying, "I'm going to need at least 2 days with it." "All right, Granny," Izuku said before placing the backpack on her workbench. Granny halted her inspection of his suit and reached for the backpack, unzipping it and spilling out its contents. Granny instantly scowled and turned around on Izuku. Izuku sighed, realizing that she was correct. This wasn't something he could rush, and perhaps a few days off was for the best. With the heroes noticing him, he should probably wait until things settle before pursuing the core Shi-Hasaikai families, even without his suit. "Repudiate my statement that you should not pay me," she yelled at him while shaking the Rolex she had picked up, but Izuku shook his head, refusing to back down. "And I promise to pay you because it's the least I can do. At the very least, you ought to be compensated for your illegal actions." Granny growled as she tossed the Rolex onto the work table, saying, "I won't have you do this for me without giving you something, but if you never spend it, that's okay. You don't have to pay me for this work because you saved my life, Ash. This is what I want to do for you." Izuku nodded. Recalling the evening he had first met Granny B, she whispered, "I owe you my life." It was some time after his master had left him, and not long after All Might had passed away. At the time, Granny was in the process of leaving the support tech industry. The company she had worked for had been founded when heroes were just starting out, but heroes now wanted the best support equipment, and the company she had worked for had been bought out. That night, while she was cleaning out the last of her tools and equipment, a group of thieves came to clean out the place. Since the fall of the symbol of peace, crime in Kamino had been steadily increasing. Hearing the noise, Izuku had been in the area searching for the League of Villains. He had arrived and begun to kill the thieves, but he was terribly unprepared as the majority of his equipment at the time consisted of bits of metal that he had melted into a semi-protective Shipaya had taken a shot to the side and fallen to the ground before exploding the thief with flames. Granny approached him at that moment because her vision wasn't entirely gone and she could see where he was, as well as see the bullet thanks to her echolocation. To be honest, Granny was saving his life, not the other way around. Look, Granny, you don't have to use the money or anything else, save it to pay for a lawyer in case the police find out what you've been doing for me, donate it to charity, or save it for your grandkids. He had passed out shortly after she sat next to him, and he still didn't know how she had gotten him out of there and all the way to her home in the country. When he woke up, Granny thanked him for saving her life and essentially coerced him into accepting her assistance in making his support gear. Izuku snarled as Granny sighed, "No matter what you do with it, it will be 1,000 times better than in the hands of scum." She swung the pile of valuables into an iron drum and covered it, saying, "Fine, I'll take it." Based on the noise it made, he was certain that was where Granny kept all of the money and valuables he gave her, and they did this almost every time he received repairs from her. "Okay, that's enough now that you've bullied this old woman enough, now go make yourself useful. I need to know what's in the bag that's on the table in my dining room." Izuku nodded and grinned as she said, "Go get it for me." He left to get what she had asked for, saying, "Sure thing. Thanks again, Granny." Izuku entered her home from the garage, went through the back door, and entered the dining room. He saw a lot of pictures all over the place, most of them of her family, including a picture of Granny as a newborn with her husband and their oldest daughter, and a picture of Granny holding an award that her boss had given her. If he had to guess why Granny had insisted on making his gear, he would say that she simply missed working on support gear and saw this as a chance to continue doing what she loved. Izuku noticed a big paper bag on the table and reached for it, feeling his eyes well up with tears as he saw what was inside. A stack of microwavable meals with a note on top. Sure, it was just convenience store fare, but the fact that she had done this for him said a lot. He wiped his eyes and picked up the bag, realizing that it would be pointless to go and tell her that he couldn't take them because she would likely threaten to stop working on his suit if he did. After accepting the meals with gratitude, he left through the front door, making sure it locked behind him, and headed back to the hills. As she threw his mask into a corner with a stack of other scrap metal, she laughed and said, "That damn kid should be more selfish, after all he's doing more than the vast majority of heroes." "Now then, time for version 2. She said, spreading out a blueprint with a broad smile on her face. "I bet those Yakuza bastards will shit themselves when they see this." Like a witch over a boiling cauldron, she laughed as she spoke. Tenya was standing in front of two of his fellow heroes. He had been very successful in assembling heroes for his Ifrit task force, and he was sure his brother would be proud of him, but there would be time for self-congratulation. Best Jeanist was present for his skills in capture, and Backdraft was there for his water quirk, which would have been crucial in putting out Ifrit's fire. He would have preferred Todoroki, but Bakugo's words made too much sense in that regard. Eraserhead Iida had just entered, and Iida approached the long black-haired man and extended his hand. Shota's bloodshot eyes met Iida's deep blue ones, and Iida said, "Sensei, it's good to see you after so long." Shota shook Iida's hand and said, "I'm not your teacher anymore, Ingenium, just call me Aizawa or Eraserhead if that's easier," before sitting down next to Best Jeanist. It appeared that both he and Bakugo had been successful in enlisting their respective heroes, and the doors were flung open once more when Inasa Yorashi, better known by his stage name Gale Force, shouted into the room. "The Gale Force is on duty." Iida massaged his forehead while glancing at Inasa. The loudmouth was picked because of his wind abilities, which prevented fire from spreading, and his ability to fly, which made sure Ifrit wouldn't get away a second time. His personality was undeniable despite his talent. "Yes, thank you, Yorashi. Please take a seat so we can get started," Iida said, gesturing to one of the available seats. 2 seats remained unoccupied even after Inasa took his, but Iida knew that would remain so because the 2 heroes he had invited to this meeting had flatly turned him down in favor of something else, so Iida could only hope they were successful. "Now, I'd like to thank everyone for coming again. I'll go over it again to make sure there are no misunderstandings, but you all understand why I asked you here. We are going to be going after the vigilante known as Ifrit," Iida said, coughing before shutting off the lights and turning on a projector at the back of the room. A picture of Ifrit from Iida's video of their altercation appeared on the wall. The video from that encounter suddenly started to play. Our target is highly skilled in combat and usage of their quirk. After doing research, I've found that he is responsible for the death of several League of Villains members and the destruction of multiple crime families, some of which were taken out in a single night. Iida observed the assembled heroes and saw that they were all very involved. As of yet, we don't have a solid location for him and therefore can't formulate a plan, but we know that he has a vested interest in Yakuza families. The most recent family he wiped out was the Gozo family, but Senji Gozo, their leader, survived. I'm told that his surgery was successful and he will be able to talk with me today. I am hopeful that with his testimony we'll know where Ifrit's next target is and lay a trap for him. Iida halted the projector by pressing a button, then reactivated the lights. Best Jeanist held up a finger and asked, "Now are there any questions?" "Yes," inquired Iida. "We can see that he's competent in combat and he definitely has a fire quirk, but given what you showed us, is it safe to assume that at the very least his mask is a support item? Is there any way to track him via that?" Iida shook his head in agreement. "I've had Team Idaten on that, but so far we've come up with nothing. We've made the rounds through several support companies and even asked prisoners accused of selling bootleg support gear for assistance, but none of them recognize it." The Best Jeanist rubbed his chin and let out a. It was Backdraft who spoke next. Iida rubbed his chin in response to Backdraft's line of inquiry. "Do we have any idea how his quirk works? Is it similar to Endeavor's or something else? Also, how hot does his fire burn? I saw that it melted the railing at the docks, but is that the upper limit or can it burn even hotter?" "Honestly, we're not sure. The working theory is that it is similar to Endeavor's quirk, but that's just wishful thinking at the end of the day. We're assuming that his fire burns at around 1500 degrees Celsius. He might be able to push it a few hundred degrees higher, but given our fight with him I wouldn't put him above 2000. Iida stated before Aizawa spoke. "That would be a grave mistake, Ingenium," Aizawa stated while sitting upright. When his teacher said that, Iida raised an eyebrow. Iida managed to catch himself in time to ask, "And why is that Sen Eraserhead?" "He was holding back with you two. He never used his flames directly on either of you. Either he didn't think you two were worth it or he didn't want to hurt you. Either way, I'd say 1500 is this guy's minimum at best. It's his median. It would be best to err on the side of caution and assume he has the capability to melt steel with ease." Aizawa had dealt with villains and the occasional vigilante for years, so it was impossible that the destruction this Ifrit could cause was his upper limit. If he had to push himself to use such offensive force, those thugs didn't deserve it. As he stood there, Iida reflected on their altercation with Ifrit and concluded that his old mentor was right. He could have easily used long-range fire attacks against Iida or surrounded Ishido and Senji with flames, but he chose not to. Iida made a perfect 90-degree bow and said, "Thank you for the insight, Eraserhead, sir." Aizawa gave an eye roll. With a raised hand, Inasa exclaimed, "Yes, I have a question," as though he were still a pupil. Iida stood up straight and repositioned his glasses. Iida said, "Go ahead, Yorashi," and Inasa grinned. He inquired, "Who else will be on this team?" Iida turned to face the two vacant seats. "Yes, two more heroes will be joining us and they are." Katsuki's face was deeply frowning as he got off the bullet train. Katsuki yelled, "Why the fuck did you come with me?" Kirishima trailed behind him. Kirishima adjusted his round shades and said, "I told you, man, we're working together so nobody goes anywhere alone," as the two left the station. Both were wearing civilian attire. Katsuki was strolling around in a loose-fitting pair of jeans and a t-shirt, while Kirishima was sporting black jeans and a button-down shirt. Thinking of the night he, Iida, Todoroki, and Momo arrived to save Katsuki from the League of Villains, Kirishima remarked, "Man, I haven't been back to Kamino in ages. Not since that night. The night All Might passed away. We ought to go to the memorial," Kirishima suggested. After giving his friend a quick glance over his shoulder, Katsuki nodded. As the two of them headed to the memorial for All Might on the street proper, he said, "Yeah, we should." The statue of the symbol of peace, with one fist raised high in the air, was genuinely enormous. In the middle of what was formerly the Kamino crater stood the statue. The final battle of All Might. It had been gradually restored in recent years, extending from this very statue. Action figures and flowers were among the numerous offerings at the statue's base. Katsuki gazed up into All Might's stone face. He and Izuku had always admired the man, who was the epitome of a hero, as strong, selfless, morally upright, and more. Being in front of the man's effigy made Katsuki feel so small. Gazing up at the statue, Kirishima remarked, Sometimes it seems like we'll never get to that point, doesn't it? Katsuki tightened his jaw. Katsuki turned away from the statue and remarked, "We have no choice but to reach that level no matter what, otherwise All Might died for nothing." Kirishima turned her attention from the statue of All Might to Katsuki's direction and said, "Come on, we're here to look for clues about Ifrit." He slapped his palms together in front of his face and swiftly turned back to face the statue. He yelled, "Thank you for everything," and hurried after Katsuki. Rikiya Yatsubashi entered a room with monitors lining the back wall. Skeptic was seated in front of the wall of screens, looking between each one while typing frantically. As he moved to stand next to the man with the black hair, he asked with a charming smile, "How goes the search, Skeptic?" "Slowly Destro sir, whoever this Ifrit is, he's quite adept at avoiding cameras. It's like he has a sixth sense for a camera's blind spot, but I'm steadily compiling a map of where he could be hiding out. Going back 7 years when he first appeared, Kamino Ward was his hunting ground and his prey was the League of Villains." Rikiya gave a nod. Skeptic nodded in agreement with Destro's statement. "Ah, he did us a favor there. Shigaraki and his ilk were a hindrance to the world we want to build. The League was merely a group of kids having tantrums and smashing everything they saw in comparison to the Meta Liberation Army." Skeptic believed that such people were unfit to live in the world that Destro wished to create. His hunting pattern changed a year after that. He moved to Tokyo and began the systematic destruction of Yakuza families. At first, it was random, but then there was another shift where he deliberately started targeting Overhaul's organization. It was some time after Overhaul was attacked by Night Eye and his agency. That mission was a failure and resulted in the death of Night Eye. I think there might be a connection there, but I have nothing concrete to support that. This Ifrit was beginning to catch Skeptic's attention, and Rikiya found it odd that he was having this much difficulty tracking down a single person. Skeptic bowed his head, but Destro put a hand on his shoulder. "With the information I have so far, all I can say for sure is that he must be in the countryside outside Tokyo, but there are numerous towns and sprawling wilderness to comb through. It will take more time before I can pinpoint his location." Rikiya left the inspired Skeptic after hearing the door close behind him. "Do not apologize, old friend. I am a patient man. I know you'll succeed given enough time." Skeptic yelled, typing more quickly, "I will not fail you, Destro." Various perspectives of Tokyo were displayed on flashing screens via security and traffic cameras. Izuku had only one objective in mind as he slipped down a dim alley. He returned to Tokyo after consuming one of the bentos that Granny had given him. There was somewhere he needed to be right away. Since he was without his suit, it would be risky, and if he got into trouble, it would be a tough battle. Izuku was wearing filthy jeans, worn sneakers, and a maroon hoodie that cast shadows over his face. Following his master's instructions, he had entered Tokyo while avoiding cameras. You need to always assume there's someone watching. Analyze your surroundings and think of the best place for a camera because more times than not there will be one. He arrived at his destination at the former residence of the Gozo family by applying that knowledge. Fortunately, it didn't appear that the police had raided the location yet, but they would undoubtedly arrive shortly. Slipping toward the complex's back wall, he leapt the stone wall and landed in the back garden. He felt nauseous as he surveyed the opulent backyard. He strode to the back door and grasped the handle, growling, "They can afford to live so lavishly on the misery of others." The handle melted to the ground after becoming red-hot in his hands. Izuku cautiously pushed the door open and went inside. He listened to the sounds of the house's interior while standing at the door. He could tell no one was home because the air was still. Stalking through the house, Izuku made his way inside. There, he located the office and turned on the computer. Like the rest of the house, the office was luxurious, which infuriated Izuku. Ifrit's words, burn it all, emerged in Izuku's mind as a haze of heat rose from his body. Izuku gave a headshake. He hissed, quiet, as he started to search the computer's files. Going through folder after folder, Izuku asked, "What did you know, Senji?" The majority of it appeared to be the family's everyday activities. Fortunately, the computer wasn't heavily encrypted because it appeared Senji had assumed he would be coming back. He leaned back and remarked, "None of this shit is useful for finding the head of this snake." Izuku went and began examining the family's shipping manifests after Wade Senji mentioned bringing those individuals to a meeting place. "Where did you transport this package?" Izuku saw a warehouse where those people were to be sent and thought, "I guess that's as good a place to start as any." He got up and set his hand on fire, knowing he shouldn't but having to send a message because, even though Senji might have survived, if he did manage to return, nothing would be waiting for him and the message would be sent to whoever the Shi Hasaikai boss was. When Izuku opened the drawers and discovered piles of paper, He set them on fire, reducing this house to ashes. Once his suit was fixed, Izuku would head to the human trafficker's drop-off location to see what might be there, but it was best he waited until his suit was finished. "Remember, boy, haste makes waste," Izuku said as he left the complex's rear and again hopped the fence and walked down the alley into the bright sunshine. "You must examine everything and exercise patience. As long as you take the correct step, it doesn't matter how long it takes." Everything Izuku was able to do was made possible by her training, so he couldn't help but smile as he walked down the sidewalk. "Thanks, Master," he said as he left the city. When an alert appeared on one of his many screens, Skeptic was about to ignore it when he saw the name Gozo cross across the bottom of the screen. He paused his work and read the article, which stated that the Gozo family complex had apparently caught fire under mysterious circumstances. Skeptic immediately began looking through the camera feeds in that area and paused one, saying, "Oh, there you are," as he looked at the reflection of a nearby store. It was a brief clip of the figure walking, but it was sufficient. Skeptic was able to identify Ifrit's gate with a solid few seconds of footage. This allowed Skeptic to track Ifrit out of the city, and he started typing a police officer with connections to the Liberation Army to ask that any electronics found in the Gozo complex's wreckage be given to him. Skeptic then sat back and grinned, saying, "I've got you now," as he started to assemble a team to kill this Ifrit. Senji Gozo opened his eyes slowly, but only one of them obeyed his orders. Something was covering his left eye. His hand was caught on something as he reached up toward it. He looked down at his left hand, which was cuffed to the bed rail, and said, "Wah?" His memories began to return as he gazed at the restraint. The Ifrit burned him, and his men were dead. The room's heart monitor started racing at the mere thought of those luminous green eyes and the scent of his charred flesh. It appeared that he was in a hospital. His final memory was of the monster charging at him before the hero intervened to save him. Heroes, in Senji's opinion, were jerks who merely stood in his way. He didn't love them and thought they did too, but that pink chick had kept him safe. At this point, Senji also recalled that he had been captured after failing at his job. He was aware that the large man would not tolerate that. Sooner or later, someone would come for him. The boss would not allow the heroes to approach him, so they would have to. He tugged at the rail of his bed and said, "Fuck, I have to leave." Despite his weakness from being put under, he had enough energy to bend the rail because he was afraid of dying. He pulled the rail out of the cuff and tore it from the rest of the bed with a few more yanks. Senji stumbled to his feet after falling out of the bed. He tore the monitor patches and the IV off his hand. Senji was aware that nurses would be racing to his room when the heart monitor abruptly stopped working. He staggered over and shambled through the door. He gasped as he staggered down the hallway, the rattling of the cuff on his wrist seeming to reverberate throughout the room. "Shit, I have to leave. If I make it to the boss and say I escaped, maybe he'll forgive me." Senji's heartbeat quickened, and his face started to pound too. He clawed at the bandages covering his face, exposing more of his burned features, but he was barely able to breathe through them all. He heard a flurry of footsteps coming toward his room as he turned the corner. In all honesty, he had no idea, but he said, "Almost there." He had no idea how his hospital was set up, but surely there must be an elevator close by. As he walked down the hall, leaning against the wall for support, he thought to himself. Senji saw his salvation an elevator as he turned another corner. On his way to the elevator, he started to laugh, but it sounded more like a lung cough. He slammed into the wall and hit the down key. "Come on, come on, come on," he grimly uttered, his breath obscuring the elevator's metal door. When the door finally opened, the hallway was filled with light. "Yes," Senji exclaimed just before a fist smashed out of his back and through his stomach. Before Senji fell on top of his removed innards, his blood was all over the floor as the fist pulled away from his guts, causing them to spill. Senji's gaze lifted to the big man who had just punched him in the gut. Before the door shut, all he saw was red hair and a black and white bird mask. More blood came out of Senji's cough. He wouldn't die before getting the final word in, even though the world was rapidly disappearing. In his final moments, he had Senji draw something on the elevator door with his blood-soaked hand. A group of nurses later discovered that Senji Gozo had been murdered. Disembowelment was the cause of death. Eraserhead and Iida stood over Senji Gozo's covered body. Iida clenched his fists and bit his lip. Iida said, "We were too late, they got to him," as she turned her back on the corpse. After a brief glance at Iida, Aizawa turned to face the officers. "Do we have any idea who performed the hit?" he inquired. To be honest, Iida ought to be doing this. Since this was his task force, he ought to be in charge, but Iida was still a young hero, and death still bothered him. He was uneasy about the murder. There, one of the detectives went through some of the notes. No, sorry sir. The camera in the elevator was damaged prior to the suspect entering and the suspect never fully exited the elevator to perform the murder. All the security cameras were able to get was the size of the man's fist and forearm. The guy must be jacked judging by the forearm, and his fist was the size of a bowling ball. It took only one punch for him to completely gut the victim. The detective replied with a shiver. Aizawa knelt over Senji's body and pulled the blanket away from him. His hand caught Aizawa's attention as her gaze wandered over every part of his body. Observing the bruise on his finger, he inquired, "What happened to his finger?" The detective shook his head and asked, "Was he tortured before being killed?" Aizawa furrowed his brow at that description, got up, pulled Senji's hand away from the door, and then pushed aside the brace for the elevator door before letting it close. No, the guy's hand was pressed up against the elevator, and when it opened, his finger fell in. The person inside screamed and ran the door repeatedly shut on his finger until someone was able to prop the door open. "Eraserhead, what are you doing?" After gathering himself, Iida asked, and Aizawa saw what he was looking for as the door closed. "Look there." He gestured to Iida and the detective, pointing out 6 symbols heavily smeared and written in blood. SS. WH-472. What does that signify? Aizawa got up and Iida asked. The detective recorded the note in his booklet, saying, "I don't know, but he wrote it down in his final moments, so it must be something significant." The shaggy-haired man nodded and then left, followed by Iida. "I'll have my men look into this. Well done, Eraserhead. This is the last thing we can do. You ought to return and inform everyone of what transpired." The younger hero nodded as Aizawa and Iida entered the elevator. "I'll look around and see if I can find any trace of our murderer." When they arrived at the hospital's ground floor, the two said, "Of course, Eraserhead, I'll tell them right away." After discarding the bloody towel he had been using to wipe his fist, Rappa entered the Shi Hasaikai base and proceeded through the underground facility before stopping outside a door. He turned the knob and opened the door without knocking, revealing his boss Overhaul and Chronostasis inside the room. "How dare you be so disrespectful, Rappa? Before entering Overhaul's presence, you ought to introduce yourself." Chronostasis scowled at the bigger man who sneered. "I'm here to inform you that Gozo is in the hospital, dead gutted. A janitor is not who I am. If I'm going to kill someone, I want a challenge." Overhaul glanced up from his computer screen at the ham-fisted brute in front of him, and Chronostasis's white hair started to flail as he looked at Rappa. Rappa ranted, ignoring Chronostasis's outburst. "You arrogant creature!" As Rappa raised his fists, he yelled. "Oh, come get it! You want some!" he yelled. Shisaki said quietly, "That's enough out of you too," but his innate desire to kill was enough to end any potential fight. Rappa merely crossed his arms and sighed. Chronostasis said, "Apologies, Overhaul," bowing low. "Well done, Rappa. Despite your complaints, you performed admirably. You're dismissed," Overhaul declared, and the bigger man snarled but followed orders. Chronostasis moved to stand by Overhaul's side, and the door slammed shut. When Overhaul waved his hand, he grumbled, "That man is a beast in human skin." Before his phone started ringing, Overhaul said, "Yes, but he's my beast, and as long as he follows my orders he has a place here." Chronostasis picked up the phone and handed it to Overhaul, who answered. "Hey?" he inquired. One could count the number of people who were aware of this figure, and they were all trusted. Overhaul leaned sideways in his chair and said, "This is Re Destro, and I'm calling about your Ifrit situation." "What have you got for me, too?" Re Destro laughed as he asked. Overhaul shrugged when he was told, "Well, you may not know it yet, but Ifrit visited the Gozo household and burned it to the ground. And Senji is dead. I was informed that his entire family was killed, so I didn't think that place was worth anything." Overhaul didn't understand why Rikia felt the need to tell him all of this, but the bastard only spared me the trouble of handling it myself. "Overhaul, I'm shocked at you. Are you not concerned about any information he may have obtained during his visit? For example, what events might have taken place at Southside Warehouse 472? As he combed through the files on his computer, Overhaul briefly considered what Rikia was asking. Shisaki had no reason to inform Rikia that the Southside Warehouse 472 was empty, but it was one of the warehouses where the doctor transported his test subjects using a teleportation Nomu. As he heard multiple claps over the speakers of his phone, Overhaul lied and said, "As I said, there's nothing he could have found there. That warehouse has been cleaned out already." "Oh, that's comforting because when he gets there, my team will be waiting for him. In the ensuing altercation, I would hate for anything important to be lost. Overhaul, you're a very diligent business partner." Regarding the trigger, I asked for the procedure. Overhaul rolled his eyes when the drug was brought up. It will be delivered right away to the warehouse. Destro nodded on his end. I advise you to have your team prepared to pick it up. Your Ifrit issue will be resolved immediately and by the end of the week. Rikia said, goodbye, and hung up. The receiver was put back in its cradle by Overhaul. Chronostasis has the trigger delivery team go through that warehouse like a fine-tooth comb. Although I doubt it, the doctor might leave something that could be used against him. Have that team monitor the warehouse as well. I want to know everything I can about Ifrit in case he manages to get away. Chronostasis bent his head and said, I want to know where the Ifrit lays its head if they can follow him. He departed to carry out Overhaul's directive, saying, of course Overhaul, I'll have my men seated personally. Katsuki proceeded further into Kamino Ward after departing from All Might's memorial. So, Katsuki, what exactly are we looking for here? After 5 years, are you still looking for hints? Kirishima inquired as Katsuki combed through his hair. To be honest, Katsuki wasn't searching for Ifrit's whereabouts. Instead, he was hoping to uncover evidence that Izuku was hiding behind that mask. The man that Ifrit saved on that bank video will be the subject of our conversation. He's the only person who, as far as I can tell, actually interacted with him. Eijiro raised an eyebrow in response to Katsuki's statement. He must be able to provide us with something. Katsuki rolled his eyes and said, well, I suppose that's something. Okay, then let's do this. As the two entered a corporate building, he declared, we're already here. Katsuki approached reception and said, I need to speak with Mr. Matsui regarding some official matters, before flashing his hero credentials. The man stammered, oh right away ground zero. Then he called, he should be with you for a little while. Kirishima bowed slightly as Katsuki moved a short distance away from the desk. He smiled as he approached Katsuki and said, thanks, my guy. As Katsuki snarled, Kirishima reprimanded, your bedside manner sucks, dude. How are you going to be number one if you can't even say a proper thank you? He yelled, fuck off. He knew I was grateful, all right, upon Kirishima's shrug. Before the two could really start arguing, a man in a suit showed up. It's still nice to hear you know. This man could be described as average. He was generic in every way, including his suit and haircut. His glasses were his only distinguishing feature. They were polished and octagonal in shape. As he walked, they caught the light, showing that neither lens had any smudges. As Katsuki and Eijiro gazed at the man, he asked, you wanted to speak with me? Eijiro took the initiative and said, sure did. We have just a couple of questions if you don't mind. The man nodded after glancing at the two. He led the two heroes over and said, okay, there's a conference room just over there. Eijiro introduced himself and Katsuki after the door had been securely closed behind them. Katsuki interrupted Kirishima before he could introduce their questions, saying, I'm Red Riot, this is Ground Zero, and we're here to ask you about. Mr. Matsui raised an eyebrow at the two heroes and said, we want to know about the night you were saved by Ifrit. Katsuki stepped forward and he said, what, that happened years ago, why do you want to know? The person who saved you has been connected to several crimes and we're looking into it. You're one of the few people who have had a genuine interaction with him, so we want you to tell us in your own words what happened. Give us what reading a police report can't. Please. Eijiro's eyes widened at the sincerity he begged because this was important enough. Matsui sighed after glancing at the blonde hero. As the three sat down at the table, he said, okay, fine, this is pretty much an extra break for me anyway. Take a seat. It was a regular night really. Worked late, was heading home and didn't feel like cooking, so thought I'd order takeout and went by the ATM to get some cash. Soon as I get the money in my hands, something smacks me in the back of the head. Next thing I know, I'm on the ground. The guy snatches the money off the ground and I'm like, okay, you got what you came for, now leave so I can go to the hospital. Mr. Matsui is now holding his hands so tightly that his knuckles are white. He is gritting his teeth and exhaling. The man initially appeared to be more annoyed than furious about being robbed, but that quickly changed. Mr. Matsui sits back with his eyes closed, taking a deep breath and unclenching his fists as he tries to regain himself. But he doesn't. Him and two other fuckers start to kick me while I'm on the ground. I'm already dazed and can't tell up from down, barely even sure I'm still breathing, and then the first kick comes and the second and the third. They just kept going, boom, 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 over and over again. The man was exhaling with anger dripping off him. Just when I think, okay, this is it. I'm going to be beaten to death and die on the street like a dog. Then he showed up. Even from behind closed eyes, I could see the flash of light as he came in. I kept my eyes closed, but from what I heard I could tell those guys were being hurt badly. The last guy, oh my god, the sound of fists crushing a human face is not something you can forget. Matsui opened his eyes and moved forward. So everything goes quiet and I hear footsteps approaching me. I don't open my eyes because if I see this kid he might just kill me. The kid reaches down into my pocket and I'm in position to stop him as he pulls out my phone and calls the cops. So now I'm floored, I don't know what's going on. He gets off the phone and tells me I'm going to be okay. Freaking props me up against the wall and places my money back in my hand. Mr. Matsui laughs as he raises his hand to his lips. That boy freaking puts my money all neat in my hand and tells me that help is coming and just leaves. I don't know if he didn't know how much money they took from me or if he thought I just deserved more for what happened, but he gave me several more bills than they took from me. Mr. Matsui withdrew his hand from his mouth and shook his head. Sorry, I know it's not funny, but after All Might died, Kamino became a war zone, and that kid was the only thing that kept this place from falling into complete anarchy. Eijiro tilted his head sideways. As Mr. Matsui shook his head, he questioned, only him, what about the heroes in the area they were helping out, right? You mean the heroes that retired after All Might died because they couldn't handle the pressure? Or do you mean the heroes who only came here for a couple of months to boost their ratings and then go on their merry way? Yeah. No villain was scared of them, that kid though. You light a match in a dark alley and they scattered like roaches. Those flames kept the light in our eyes, but now he's gone and we're barely hanging on by a thread. Throughout this entire time, Katsuki hadn't talked. Mr. Matsui sneered, you kept calling him a kid, why? Because he was a kid. I didn't know until he spoke he sounded no older than 16. I managed to open my eyes a little and well, I couldn't tell what he looked like in that hood of his, but I'll never forget those glowing green eyes. Look, I don't know what you two want with him, but the only crime he's committed is cleaning up after heroes. Now if you don't have any other questions, I'll be heading back to work. Mr. Matsui straightened up and straightened his suit, but he left without being stopped by either hero. Soon after Katsuki got up from the table, Kirishima followed him to the door. The two left the company headquarters. After standing conspicuously on the sidewalk, Katsuki started to leave. I can't believe it, Eijiro. For a long time now I thought things were getting better. I thought we were starting to fill the hole that All Might left, and now I realize it's so much deeper. This is where the symbol of peace died and it's become like this. He yelled and raised his hand. Eijiro grinned and slammed his fists together, saying, I can't stand it, Eijiro. I won't stand for it. While we're here investigating, we're going to clean up Kamino. The two proceeded into Kamino Ward in search of information regarding Ifrit and to retake the streets, saying, I'm with you, man, let's do it. They demonstrate to the populace that heroes weren't killed by All Might. Shoko glanced at her phone and sighed. Over the past few days, she had attempted to text and call Katsuki, but she had not received a response since he left the cafe copyright that evening. Katsuki would normally send her an angry text telling her to fuck off or something at this point, but instead there was total radio silence. She sighed. It was not like that. Shoko had been starting to worry, but she decided to stop after phoning Ida and learning that he was simply overburdened with work related to the reason Ida had called him that evening. Knowing how stubborn Katsuki could be about such matters, Shoko left him to his own devices and focused entirely on her patrol. He'll talk when he wants to. As part of her father's rotating patrol system, she was in Tokyo's south side. In order to have complete coverage of the city, he moved his sidekicks around it while keeping an eye on the center so he could respond to any issues wherever they might arise. As night descended upon the city, she sighed as she strolled through the streets, which were gradually growing darker. She recalled the evenings she spent searching the streets for Izuku because of these nighttime patrols. She had been out there night after night, regardless of the weather. Naturally, Katsuki was also playing a role, but despite months of searching, their friend had not been spotted. Shoko walked with her fist clenched. She simply couldn't accept that Izuku was dead. If she believed he was, it would be simpler. At least she would know where to go see him if he was dead. She could go on, but as long as she thought he was still alive, a hole would remain in her heart that would never go away. She was reminded by that hole of her older brother Toya, who she had also lost. She was well aware of what had happened to him, but he had also vanished one day. The tale of her brother's fate was narrated in the little urn in their back room. She had struggled to control her flames as a child, not because she was untalented or incompetent, but rather because she was afraid of what they might do to her. She had witnessed the burns on Toya's arms and chest, but he continued to use his quirk. She was frightened, but Izuku intervened. As long as she kept in mind that they would never harm her, he had been the one to show her that her flames were different from her brother's. She only realized how much she had depended on Izuku after he vanished, and then he was gone. Katsuki was equally as shaken at the time as she was, so she was unable to rely on him. He held himself responsible for Izuku's fate. No, she had to provide the support, just as Izuku did for her, and she couldn't be the one seeking it for Katsuki. Izuku was gone, and Katsuki would vanish in a different and possibly worse way if she didn't take action. They had supported each other and put a lot of effort into getting into UA. She was even able to provide for her father because of it. Though he would never acknowledge it, Enji Todoroki was shaken by Izuku's disappearance. He was undoubtedly reminded of Toya, and by training her, Shoko made him concentrate on the present. She wanted to train in the dojo the following morning, even if she had to spend the entire night searching for Izuku. Izuku was always there for anyone in need, and she refused to do any less because that's what he would do. Shoko was walking in deep concentration when she noticed the all-too-familiar smoke odor. She noticed a plume of smoke rising from the south as she looked up at the sky. Shoko went into hero mode right away. To gain a better view, she threw herself onto the rooftop and noticed a raging fire toward the smoke. She brought her mouth to her wrist. As she made an ice path to slide across the rooftops, she said, "This is Iceburn. I'm reporting a large fire in the South Warehouse District. I'm currently en route, send backup." Burnin replied over the radio channel, "Acknowledged, Iceburn emergency services will be notified and reinforcements are being rerouted to your destination," while Shoko gave a nod. As she approached the edge of the warehouse district, she said, "Iceburn out." At that moment, an explosion shook the buildings around her. A news van was already approaching the fence, as Shoko could see. She shook her head, wondering how they arrived so quickly. "A reporter is here already," she asked herself. As she fell to the ground, she said, "This is no time for that." Immediately after her right foot touched the ground, a wall of ice materialized, separating the warehouse district from the rest of the street. She blasted herself over the fence into the warehouse district proper and started running to the fire's epicenter, saying, "Please stay back, I'm not aware of the situation just yet, and it's not safe." Shoko put out any outlying fires with her ice as she closed in, preventing them from spreading. She had just extinguished a fire when a nearby wall collapsed. A white-haired man slammed into the metal doors of another warehouse as he flew past her. As the person slid to the ground with their chest held, the metal crumpled around them. "Bastard!" the man snarled as he started to slowly stand up. After getting over her shock, Shoko started to approach the man, but something flew by her. She could only sense the heat as it slammed past her and struck the white-haired man, forcing him further into the ruined bay doors, but she was unable to see what it was. She noticed a humanoid figure standing over the man with his foot on his face as the figure came to a stop. Whatever they were hurt, and the figure was covered in the smell of burning blood. The figure lifted its foot as they stood there, and as it started to descend toward the man's head, flames engulfed it. Shoko simply responded by hurling ice fragments. "Stop!" she yelled, causing the figure to launch itself onto the roof in order to evade her unplanned assault. She saw the green eyes of the masked figure staring at her. "Shoko." She heard it over the roaring flames and breaking ice, but she wasn't sure how. They knew her name, whoever they were. Not only were they aware of it, but their delivery gave the impression that they knew her very well. For some reason, she felt secure enough to gaze into the eyes of this figure. In some way, she knew they wouldn't harm her. Before shooting a stream of fire down at the unconscious man, the figure gazed at her. Instinctively, Shoko covered him with a thick layer of ice. Steam swept across the space as the two oddities were brought into contact. The burning man was gone, but Shoko managed to make a pillar of ice rise above the cloud of steam. She asked, "Whoa, who was that?" Izuku had decided to hold off on pursuing the warehouse until his new suit was ready, so he had returned to the countryside yesterday. He listened to the sounds of nature outside his house while sitting in the little shrine and scratching his head. Memories began to pour out of him as he did this. Izuku stood in his room, admiring the All Might memorabilia that covered every available inch of space. He couldn't become a hero like Uncle Enji or All Might. Izuku didn't want his father to talk about the three of them moving to America so he could follow his dreams there and the family wouldn't have to be apart for months at a time. He lived in Japan, and while he could travel to America and return as a certified hero, it seemed more like he was evading his past actions and circumnavigating the system to obtain what he desired. In his heart, he had no regrets about saving Katsuki. Although he had killed someone, he felt that the villain's life at the time was insignificant compared to Katsuki's. He didn't think that life was worth anything, but perhaps it was to someone else. He flopped onto his back and sat down on his bed. Perhaps he was being too critical of himself and overanalyzing the situation. He had acted in accordance with his current moral convictions. He clenched his fist and sat up. Hadn't he done the right thing by saving Katsuki's life? The heroes had not improved, even if the public believed that what he had done was wrong. Even though it was wrong, Katsuki had to take action because they were all just standing there and none of them were going to help him. He lit a flame in his hand and said, "Just because I'm not a hero doesn't mean I can't help people. I should do my best to help whenever and wherever I can." Then he remembered that he would be conducting check-ins to ensure that the use of his quirk was within normal bounds. If he was going through with this, he would be deprived of his quirk. He would be arrested and his family's reputation would be further damaged if it turned out that he was still abusing his quirk. He held his head up and yelled, "Then what am I going to do?" Before getting to his feet, he said as he left his room and stepped outside into the cool night air, "I need to think." He walked, breathing it in slowly. At night, the city was eerily silent. He heard the sound of tires screeching because of this silence. Turning, Izuku headed in that direction. He ducked back behind it as soon as he turned the corner, which was only a few streets over. Izuku glanced around the bend in the path. A man with a gun was standing next to the driver's side window of a car down the street, pointing the weapon at the driver. "Get out of the car. Do it now or I swear I'll blow your fucking head off." Izuku yelled at the two defenseless passengers looking through the windshield. A younger woman and an older man, most likely a father and daughter. The woman in the passenger seat was sobbing quietly, and the driver was paralyzed with fear as she stared down the gun's barrel. As his fist doubled in size, the thug yelled, "Do you think I'm fucking around? I said get out of the car," and punched the window, shattering it. Izuku stood there and watched as the man tried to pull the driver away by reaching for him. "I've got to do something." "No, don't, we're already in enough trouble. Let the heroes do their job, someone will come. We can't wait for that, he's going to kill him if we don't do something. Look, we'll call the police and they'll handle it. Haven't we done enough? We saved Katsuki because he's our friend, this guy is a stranger, are we going to risk everything for a stranger?" Izuku debated with himself whether or not he should save the man. Should he have called the police, turned away, and pretended he had done enough to save this couple, or did he want to risk what little he still had? As the thug put his gun to the man's head, Izuku turned around and said, "I fucking warned you." It was all in slow motion. As the woman started to scream, the defenseless man squeezed his eyes shut as the thug's fingers started to pull back on the trigger. This time, instead of acting involuntarily or in an instinctive manner, Izuku made the decision to approach danger. Izuku kicked the thug's arm sideways as he charged at him. The rear driver side window was shattered when the gun went off. Izuku spun around and slammed his elbow into the criminal's stomach, causing the thug's eyes to widen as he looked down at him. Before the thug staggered back, clutching his stomach as he dropped the gun, his elbow dug deep. Izuku spoke while turning away from the vehicle. His stern tone seemed to startle the driver, who slammed on the gas and sped down the street. "Get out of here now. Drive and don't stop," he said. The thug got up and turned to face Izuku. "Fucking kid, that was my way out of here. You're dead," he yelled, slamming his elbow down on the criminal's skull after Izuku easily ducked under his huge fists and kicked the man in the side of the knee, sending him to the ground. Izuku kicked the thug in the stomach to punctuate each question. "You were just going to kill them then? Just so you could escape? You didn't even give a second thought about their lives versus what you wanted, did you?" With his foot burning, Izuku raised it high for an axe kick, asking, "Why? Why do people like you get to exist to breathe and keep hurting people? You'd be better off dead." The man's head exploded, splattering blood and viscera on the ground before Izuku could finish the thug. Then he sensed a muzzle being pressed against the back of his head. He heard a woman say, "That's not something a kid like you should be saying." Izuku woke up to the sound of nature's lullaby, and his eyes popped open. When he looked out from the shrine, he noticed that night had fallen and that crickets and owls had taken the place of the birdsong. Izuku got to his feet, left the shrine, and took off his shirt. He approached a big tree and remarked, "Well, I'm not going to be getting much more sleep, might as well train." Its smooth wooden interior, adorned with the indentations of numerous fists, was exposed after its bark had been beaten away. It would be the third day since his encounter with Ingenium and Pinky the following morning, and he was growing more agitated. The Shi Hasaikai would be able to re-establish themselves every night he stayed indoors. Izuku stood up and delivered his first blow. "We should hunt them now. Burn them away," is what he said. His fist struck the wood, producing a dull thud. Knowing that the voice in his head wasn't real, he said, "No, we have to wait. We need to be prepared. This could be a big break, but only if we do this right. We can't rush it." It had emerged following his master's departure. When she left, her voice became softer and softer until it eventually fell silent. He was so accustomed to talking with her that he kept her voice in his head to guide him. Anger developed in this silence. He used to protect people by punishing villains and criminals to prevent them from harming others. His master taught him that, but after she vanished, it became more about eliminating bad guys than it was about protecting him. He knew, deep down, that he had stopped enjoying the means and looking toward the end. This voice represented Izuku's desire to eradicate evil. He kept punching the tree to muffle the Ifrit's voice. Initially, it had only been a slight desire to inflict more suffering than he absolutely had to as they passed away, but after All Might passed away, the voice intensified and called for more gory demises. More and more evisceration, beating, and burning. Before he knew it, his desire to be a hero had vanished, and his only concern was putting an end to evil wherever and whenever possible. What would his master think of the person he had become was something Izuku couldn't help but wonder. Would she accept that what he was doing was necessary, or would she feel ashamed of the man he had become while she was away? Izuku's fists were more than just bruises before he realized the sun was rising. He noticed bloodstains on the tree's smooth inner wood. It had been 2 days since he had destroyed Gozo's base with fire. He should probably see how Granny B was doing. He didn't want to hurry her, but it was getting harder and harder to resist the urge to go hunting. He approached, picked up the shirt he had slung from a nearby tree, and entered the town. He knew that Granny rarely slept while working on his suit, even though it was still early in the morning. Not a second before, but after everything was finished, she would faint. Izuku opened the garage door again, and the elderly woman spoke before he could enter. She stated, "It's not ready." Izuku gazed at Granny while standing in the morning sun and feeling its warmth on his back. "I know what you're going to say, but that's how it is. This new suit needs more time. Your flame is getting hotter so fast that it's becoming harder and harder to find materials to withstand it. I'll need another day at least," she said as Izuku approached her. Izuku approached Granny and started to say, No more waiting, we need to go now," but before he could finish, his old suit and mask were thrown at him, cutting off his sentence. "Take that. I've patched it up enough so you can go out. As long as you don't get into anything too serious, it should hold up. I know how you get when you sit still for too long. Honestly, I think a few days off would do you some good, but we both know you won't listen, so take that and leave me be." She called him out of her office. Izuku hurried out of town, tucking the mask and suit under his loose-fitting hoodie. Even though this isn't his new suit, he felt instantly more at ease wearing one. He felt as though a piece of himself had been restored after going missing. Izuku examined the suit as he made his way to his shrine in the dark, noticing patches of fresh material here and there before noticing the thick bead of welding running along his mask. That indicated that Granny was in a hurry or that she no longer cared about the suit because she was never this careless. Knowing her, it was most likely the former, but as long as he had something to wear outside, it didn't matter. Determined to get enough sleep for tonight, Izuku went back to the hills and went to sleep. It would require all of his energy. With his feet propped up on the trigger case, Jiden was seated outside the disputed warehouse. In his pocket, the phone rang. He took it out of his parka, which was light blue. Knowing who it was, Jiden said, "What is it, Skeptic?" Over the previous 2 days, Skeptic had called him every 12 hours. Now, as the second day was coming to an end, that had slashed to roughly every half hour. He became openly frustrated with the constant calling, saying, "He still hasn't shown up and you calling me over and over again isn't going to change that. You have this place under satellite surveillance, right? You'd know he was here before we did." Jiden sucked his teeth at Skeptic's arrogant demeanor, saying, "Watch your tongue, Jiden. I was chosen to put this mission together and I appointed you. You would do well to remember that." Before he hung up, he said, "Whatever, I'll call you when we have something and you should do the same." Jiden had unwavering faith in Rey Destro's teachings, but Skeptic did not share this belief. It was undeniable that the man was a technological genius, but his disposition was lacking. When Jiden looked up, he saw that night had truly fallen and the sky had grown dark. Many Liberation members were waiting for the Ifrit in the warehouse district. It didn't matter that Jiden didn't know how Ifrit had gotten in trouble with Rey Destro. His destruction was justified simply by the fact that he had. To the Liberation members involved in this operation, Jiden opened his phone and texted, "Check in." Each participant received those 2 words. Main entrance clear. East fence clear. West fence clear. South fence. When he saw the incomplete text and the 3 dots that were cycling, indicating that the person was still typing, Jiden scowled. He stood up and opened the case at his feet before slipping it behind him to his group members. "Well, what is it?" he asked. The members of this ambush team had distributed the trigger overhaul that was sent to them. There was enough trigger in each unit's case for the strongest member of the group to receive a hit. However, Jiren had declined his dose. He didn't think this Ifrit could be that strong. Finally, a text message came from his phone. Something just entered through the back window of the warehouse. Before nodding, I read it. Before stomping toward the warehouse, Jiren told his men, "Get ready. I'm going to get into position." Izuku slipped in through the warehouse window after melting through it. He landed as quietly as he could on the catwalk. He was wearing the Ifrit's skin again. Although he had no idea who had given him that name, he thought it was appropriate. A fiery demon to torture Japan's avaricious and malevolent villains. There were no containers in the warehouse, and it was completely deserted. As he leapt over the catwalk's railing and fell to the ground, he asked himself, what were they using this place for? Unable to hear anyone, he stalked across the ground. A tiny room at the rear of the warehouse caught his attention as he glanced around. He went over because it was the only thing that drew his attention. Izuku opened the door, which appeared to lead to a former office. He could only imagine 10 or 15 people at a time, and that was if they were packed into the tiny space. Izuku entered the room and made his way to the rear. He speculated that there might be a hidden compartment or secret hatch where he could release a breath he had been holding and watch it fog in the air. Wait. His breath wasn't fogging that bad because it wasn't that cold. Although it wasn't particularly cold outside, Izuku was aware that his body temperature was slightly higher than the average person's. Alarms began to ring in his mind at that very moment. Less than a week had passed since Izuku was ambushed, and he had made the decision to avoid being caught in that circumstance again. He was able to leap back just as Jiden's sneak attack penetrated the office's back wall because his senses were sharpened. Ice spears shot in Izuku's direction, and he barely managed to escape the room before the ice could skewer him. As though that were the first sign of the event, the warehouse's bay doors opened, letting in a rush of people. Others jumped toward him, and they hurled projectiles at him. The wave of hatred coming at him caused Izuku's eyes to enlarge, and he reacted. He shot himself upward through the roof's skylight. He was knocked forward as he passed through the broken window, and his shoulder began to hurt. Izuku noticed a metallic lance piercing his shoulder as he looked at it. With a growl, he withdrew the lance and sealed the wound in his shoulder with fire. Ifrit turned to look at the person who had thrown the spear and saw a woman holding a twin pair of lances. She had small metal protrusions on her arms that grew into long spears before she snapped them off. Izuku got to his feet and snarled. He was stupid because there was no information here. He had been caught in the trap. As he roamed the rooftop, he noticed an increasing number of figures, and his green eyes glowed. With a slow exhale, his breath emerged through his freshly patched mask as a cloud of steam. Before he let loose a halo of flame around himself, his low voice seemed to reverberate across the rooftop. Fine then. A stream of fire trailed behind the Ifrit as he punched the lance-creating soldier in the face, knocking her off the roof, and then turned on his heel, creating a jet of flame at the back of his hand holding the spear, giving it an extra burst of speed as he hurled it. The Liberation soldiers retreated from the ring of fire. The spear screamed through the air, piercing a Liberation soldier in the stomach and pulling him along until he was pinned to the wall of a nearby warehouse, all while a high-pitched whistle sounded. The roof burst with a huge ice spire as Izuku stood there getting ready to start his next flurry. With his hood up, Jiden stood beneath the spire's peak, his face hidden from view save for his blue eyes, which were glaring at Ifrit. The Liberation soldiers got a second wind and started to move around Ifrit seriously after seeing their leader. Izuku surveyed his surroundings before meeting Jiden's gaze. He yelled, "All of you will burn," before launching himself into the air and hitting the roof's remnants with his fist. Before flames burst from where Izuku's fist struck the roof, everyone on the roof turned to stare at him. Fire sped across the rooftop, scaling everything it encountered. As the flames consumed them, the Liberation soldiers let out a scream. Izuku uttered the attack's name, Ravenous Flames, before sprinting in Jiden's direction and slamming his fist into the ice. It provided a brief respite before shattering against his hot fist, and he was thankful for the chilling feeling. Leaping from the spire, Jiden formed multiple ice spears and hurled them at Ifrit, who then formed a shield of flame to melt the ice before it could cause any harm. Jiden landed on the roof of a nearby warehouse. Jiden barely escaped a flame, feeling the heat along his right arm and realizing his sleeve had been burned away. "He seems to enjoy close combat. I'll keep him at a distance and wear him down," Jiden said. An arrow of flame appeared along Ifrit's arm as he knelt down, taking one knee as though he were drawing a bow. It then shot forward, narrowly missing Jiden once more. As he observed the ice user moving around and avoiding one arrow after another, Izuku grinned. Before leaping back, he thought, I've never been as good as master at this, but if you think you'll escape me, you're wrong. A liberation soldier slashed at him with fingers that resembled blades. He snarled and then threw open his hands. Firefly. This technique wasn't really used in the balls of fire Ida saw that night, which only appeared to emit light. Like their namesake, Izuku's fireballs swarmed around, and when they made contact with a human, they burst into a tiny firestorm that engulfed the unfortunate person they had touched. Izuku fell to the floor and let out another breath. He was getting hotter and hotter inside. He had to relax. As more adversaries gathered at the path's mouth and snarled, Izuku clenched his fists and exclaimed, "No. Burn hotter, we must be hotter. Hot enough to burn them all. Yes, burn them all." Izuku exploded toward his foes, lighting his feet and fists on fire before landing and spinning like a top, engulfing his adversaries in a swirling mass of fire. A hail of ice rushed down after him, and he leapt to the side. As he flew through the paths between the warehouses, he was pursued by ice shards sharp enough to pierce the concrete. Feeling the doping drug run through his body, Jiden threw away the now empty trigger syringe. After witnessing this Ifrit slicing through his men like a knife through butter, he reconsidered his initial belief that he would require such a device. He was able to rain down ice blades with little to no weariness because his ice powers seemed to triple in strength. As he moved his hands in pursuit of Ifrit, he laughed. "My ice will slice you to pieces, you'll be nothing more than bloody snow once I'm done," he yelled. Izuku hopped from wall to wall before launching himself into a warehouse through a window. He heard someone shouting at him and laughing, "That won't stop my ice." As promised, the ceiling above Izuku started to rumble before opening up as slicing ice repeatedly pierced it, exposing more sky with each entry beneath the torrent of icy blades. When the ceiling finally fell, Izuku started to run. He saw his target after blasting through another window. With all of his strength, he threw the flame he had created by drawing his hand back. It was Dragon Lance. He cried. As it flew through the air, the spear was aimed directly at Jiden's heart. A shield of ice materialized in front of him, blocking the spear, and the ice user grinned. Jiden was unharmed except for the steam that erupted from the impact. He yelled, "Is that your best?" and Ifrit appeared as the steam parted at his side. The strain of racing to Jiden's place had left his body smoking. Izuku sensed his flames beginning to consume him. Ifrit grabbed the mask off Jiden's face as he moved to form another shield of ice. Despite the ice, Jiden could see the swirling fires inside his mouth as if the mouth of hell had opened. Ifrit said, "Hell's breath," and then the fire burst forth in a torrent, smashing into his icy bulwark that encased the roof. The heat expanded so quickly that Jiden was blown back, his ice shield cracking and then shattering. He heard the shriek of crumpling metal as he finally came to a stop, and fire licked across his body as he flew through and into a wall. His skin was blistering from the heat, and his entire body was on fire. He was never very good at the heat because of his ice quirk, but this was more than that. His skin was burned, and as he inhaled heated air, his throat became dry. This must be what hell is like. Izuku, who was now completely under Ifrit's control, glanced down from his perch to see where Jiden had landed. Before reapplying the mask, he held it in his hand and exhaled any extra heat that might have been in his mouth. By the time he was finished, this man would be a charred corpse. Ifrit leapt from the building, destroying the warehouse Jiden had been thrown through. He heard the crunch of broken bones as he slammed his knee into Jiden's chest. Then, he grabbed his hood and pulled him out of the almost demolished bay door, throwing him face first to the ground and stepping on the back of his head before lifting his foot to end him there, smashing his skull and roasting his viscera on the concrete. He had changed into a man who enjoyed the suffering of villains. There was nothing heroic he could do. The guilty should be punished, made to feel bad about what they did, and then removed from this world like mud from a windshield. Before Ifrit could kill the man, a shout was heard in his head, breaking the hold of Ifrit and soaking his raging bloodlust. Instinctively, he leapt out of the way of the ice that had approached him. He gazed down into Shoko's mismatched eyes from the rooftop. Izuku couldn't help but say her name as he gazed into their eyes. The temptation to say her name was too strong to resist, even though he knew he shouldn't have. Even though it had been 7 years, he could still see her by her voice. She was stunning, with her two-toned hair blowing in the hot air, her eyes glowing, and the dignity with which she still carried herself, but her beauty was tarnished by the confused expression on her face. This was a man she had never met before. Izuku had only one way to release the storm of emotions that swept through him. As he knew she would, Shoko stopped him before he could blast fire down towards Jiden. After all, she was a hero because she recognized the worth in that piece of trash. Here, Izuku took the only action he could with Shoko. He fled. He ran and did everything in his power to avoid looking back because he couldn't fight her but also couldn't let her stop him. Shoko was standing in the area of the recently burned warehouse. Where the white-haired man had been lying, she stood. Fortunately, he was still breathing when he was taken away. It was fortunate for him that so many others had not received the same treatment. Even though there were fewer burned corpses now, Shoko still gave herself a hug. Even so, this degree of devastation was almost unheard of outside of her father's world. Even though she knew what fire was capable of, how could she not? A heavy hand appeared on her shoulder as if summoned by her thoughts. Endeavor asked, "Are you all right?" As Shoko inhaled deeply to prevent the smell of burnt flesh and hair from further discoloring her sinuses. The words, "I'm just as surprised as all." Endeavor clenched his fist at his daughter's statement. "I haven't seen this level of firepower out of anyone besides you. The heat and the ash in the air." Shoko shook her head when the blue flame villain was mentioned. "This is close to my limit as well, and you say that the aggressor still managed to burn enough flame to escape you. I haven't heard of a villain with this level of firepower outside of Dobby from the League of Villains. This wasn't him. These flames were green, not blue, and whoever they were, they hid their face with a mask. Dobby never did that. None of the League members did aside from Mr. Compress and Spinner, both of whom are dead. This was someone else. Dobby idolized Stain, so why would he be hunting villains?" Endeavor nodded in agreement with Shoko's conclusion. Endeavor made the factual remark, "You noticed too." As he started to move through the warehouse area, Shoko gave a nod. They entered warehouse 472 and she said, "There are signs of assault from multiple individuals. It all started in this warehouse. These weren't innocent civilians caught up in a fight between an ice and fire villain." The scorch marks were examined by two of the most skilled users of the fire quirk, who thought they were as good as pictures of the battle. As the two recreated the battle route, Endeavor remarked, "It started in this small office." He maneuvered back as the wall was shattered, moving to the center of the room before blasting himself through the ceiling. It was an ambush for the green flame guy, but why? Why was he here? What made him come to an empty warehouse? And just as importantly, why were they here to kill him? She was looking around. But there was another question that was more pressing in Shoko's mind. "Why does he seem familiar to me?" she questioned herself. Overhaul was asleep in bed when his phone rang. Chisaki, who was raised as a Yakuza member and was conditioned to be a light sleeper, reached for his phone as soon as it rang, even before the ringer had begun. "What is it?" Without displaying even the smallest hint of annoyance, he asked. When Overhaul finally remembered what Chronostasis was discussing, he sat up straight. "Sorry to disturb you, Overhaul, but my men have reported something of interest." "All right." Before Chronostasis could respond, he asked. "Ifrit managed to get away from Re-Destro's men, but we managed to find him in the countryside. We know the closest town he might be going to, based on the area we lost him in." Chisaki grinned and tightened his hold on the phone. "I personally want you there, Chrono. Assemble your troops and demolish that city. Please smoke Ifrit out, kill him when he shows up, make sure he's dead, and bring me his head. This time, no mistakes. Either you locate his body or you don't return until you have." Chronostasis dipped his head on the other end of the phone. "Take whatever personnel and equipment you need and get it done." "Of course, I'm on my way, Overhaul. Before noon tomorrow, Ifrit's head will be on your desk." Izuku's body was burning as he flew through the air, and the rushing wind did nothing to cool him down. He saw the town approaching, but the image in front of him started to grow blurry and multiply. "Just a little more," he whispered. He thought, "I'm going to crash." Ash's suit was still being worked on by Granny, who was confident she could finish it by tomorrow morning. Actually, she would call it done right away if she weren't such a perfectionist, but regrettably, she was aware of the type of person she was. It would be like sandpaper on her subconscious if she allowed this suit to leave here unfinished. Something smashed in front of her garage door while she was finishing touches. Granny jumped so hard she almost cut off a finger. She yelled, "What the hell?" as she hurried to open the garage and noticed a smoking Ash unconscious in front of it. She yelled, "Ash, what the hell happened to you?" as she noticed multiple lights in the surrounding homes coming on. She yelled, "Shit," and grabbed Ash's hood, only to yell when the material burned her fingers. As some of her neighbors peered out their windows, she hissed, "Oh great," and snatched up a crowbar, hooked it into his hood, and slowly drugged him into the garage before leaving again. She played up the doddering grandmother act while holding up her hands and saying, sorry, slight mistake in my workshop, everything's fine though." As she moved to Ash, she heard a few moans and harsh complaints, but mostly everyone just went back to sleep. She locked the garage door behind her. She ran over, grabbed a hose from the corner, and turned it on full blast, saying, "I knew the suit couldn't keep up with you anymore. You're going into hyperthermic shock." As she noticed the steam coming from Ash's body, she started hosing him down. As Granny reached for his mask and removed it, she noticed his flushed face and placed the hose on his chest, allowing the water to cascade over him. Although she was by no means a medical professional, she was fairly certain that it was not a good idea to give fluids to someone who was unconscious. Before starting to strip the young man down, Granny gave him a few pats to make sure he was cool enough to touch. Granny wished she could see very seldom, but now she would do anything to see the boy's face in front of her. She kept hosing him down, but all she could do was put her hand on his forehead. She could feel his body cooling down, though it was more slowly than she would have preferred. Before she could smell the metallic smell of blood in the air, she whispered, "Good, good, that's it, just breathe." Granny moved her hands slowly over his body, beginning at his head, moving to his neck, and ending at his shoulder. The difference between the slipperiness of blood and the flow of water was instantly apparent to her sensitive fingers. With a sigh, she shut off the water and went to get her first aid kit. As she cleaned the cut on the front of the young man's shoulder, she grumbled to him, "I told you to stay here, stay still. But no, now look at you." She trusted antibacterial material instead of the destructive sterilization of cauterization, even though it appeared that he had cauterized the exit wound, which was good. Shaking her head constantly, she turned Ash onto his side to massage the back of his shoulder. Given his youth, he was most likely as old as her eldest grandchild. She felt accountable for him. He was protecting people who couldn't defend themselves almost every night, but who was watching out for him? She pondered. Granny tried her best to pull him to a cot she had set up in the garage after tending to his wounds. She discovered that she slept better with tools and the smell of metal around her, even though she had a house to sleep in after her husband passed away. She sat down in her work chair and covered him with a thin blanket, saying, "Get some rest, you stubborn fool." She could already tell that she wouldn't be finishing any more work tonight. Holding his laptop to his chest, Skeptic pleaded, "I apologize, Destro. I thought Jitin could handle this, but it seems my confidence was misplaced." Jitin was arrested along with every one of his men who had survived the altercation. Trigger would undoubtedly be discovered in their systems, guaranteeing their arrest. A growing dark patch appeared on Ricky's face, and he stood in front of the window, clenching his fist. Hearing the door close shortly after, he muttered, "I understand your shame, Skeptic, but I would like to be left alone." Ricky tapped the Bluetooth in his ear and said, "I can't believe this. Who is this Ifrit? Jitin was one of my lieutenants and strengthened by Trigger, and yet he was defeated." He said, "Call Curious." As soon as he heard his phone's dial before it started to ring. Curious said, "Yes, Destro," with ease. To remove all annoyance from his voice, Ricky cleared his throat. Ricky said, "Curious, what were you able to record?" before Curious let out a sigh. As the mark on his face deepened, Ricky clenched his hands and said, "Not much, unfortunately. Endeavor's sidekick arrived seconds before we did and cordoned off the area with an ice wall. The only thing we saw was Ifrit's escape. Interestingly enough, as he was escaping, several cars gave chase. This is only a guess, but they seemed like Overhaul's men." His teeth were clenched as he said, "I see. He appeared to have been used as a sacrificed pawn." Shisaki's men were to follow the now flushed out Ifrit back and deal with him directly after his men were fed to the Ifrit incinerator. Destro could admire Overhaul's clever maneuver on the surface, but he was furious underneath. After insulting him, Shisaki hung him and his men like bait before catching the big fish himself. Now, he had lost a lieutenant and many men as Overhaul defeated the weakened Ifrit. He ought to set aside his more intense emotions and wait for events to unfold, but Ricky wasn't that type of man. He cared for his soldiers, unlike Shisaki, who saw the Liberation Army as nothing more than brittle knives to be thrown at his problems. For the sake of Overhaul, he had thrown them out like chum to a shark, despite their trust that he would make the best choices for them and the cause. Curious glanced at her phone for a moment before grinning and saying, "Curious, I think you should do your civic duty and report those suspicious vehicles to the heroes." Before hanging up and getting out of her news van, she said, "As you wish, Destro." She then saw Ingenium enter the crime scene. Curious ran up to the speedy hero and said, "Ingenium, grant me a moment of your time, please." After further investigation, Ingenium discovered that the villain attack in the warehouse district was another Ifrit incident, and he hurried to the scene. He became aware that Endeavor and Shoko had learned of this, and a slow note of panic ran up his spine. Katsuki's plan to keep this under wraps would fail if they chose to investigate further. When someone called out to Ingenium, he stopped his progress toward the crime scene. A reporter was walking toward him when he turned around. Although Iida was aware that reporters had a role to play and that they were a good fit for the hero work ecosystem, he had never been very good at communicating with them. "Ingenium, please give me a moment of your time," said the reporter, a woman with light purple hair and blue skin. The green hue of her eyes seemed to contrast with the black sclera. In an attempt to get past the police line and prevent her from pursuing him, he said, I'm sorry, I'm in a hurry and can't stop for any questions." Chateaus pulled out her phone and showed Iida the pictures, all of which included the license plates of the suspicious vehicles that had left the scene earlier tonight. "Wait, I have information I want to give you. I have photos if you'd like to see them." When Iida first looked at the picture, he was drawn to the green light at the top. Anywhere, he would recognize those flames. Iida took a step back and turned to face the female reporter. The blue-skinned woman smiled and he said, "Excuse me, what was your name?" Chateaus Kazuki." Iida grinned, appreciative of this unexpected boon. He had no idea how those cars were related to Ifrit, but since they could be tracked, perhaps they could eventually locate Ifrit. He said, "I don't really like the idea of speaking publicly, but he owed her this much. This is my number, please text me those photos, and if possible, I'd like to repay you with an interview if you like." Curious grinned and sent the photos to Iida. As Iida went to show the police the pictures so they could start tracking those cars, she said, "That would be much appreciated, Ingenium, I'll be in touch," and left. They simply had to take advantage of the fact that this was their first genuine lead to Ifrit. Iida called Bakugo after providing the police with the license plate numbers. He hung up and was about to call Yorashi when a voice said, "Bakugo, you need to get to Tokyo." Ifrit appeared again. He had a skirmish with an as yet unknown group. He escaped, but he had a tail that we're trying to track down. "I could use your firepower. I'll get the team assembled in the meantime." Iida turned to Shoko and felt a chill go up his spine. "Iida, who's Ifrit?" he asked. Katsuki kicked a wall next to a thug's head that had been quietly slinking away from him and yelled, "Fuck, we were looking in the wrong place." Immediately freezing the thief with his glare, Katsuki growled, "Listen here, you little shit, don't you fucking move." Eijiro shook his head, watching over the other half of the robbery team. Katsuki turned to face his friend, who merely gave him a thumbs up, and said, "Bakugo, just go. I'll handle things here, you're needed in Tokyo. Leave before your annoyance leads you to do something foolish," Katsuki said with a sardonic grin as he passed Kirishima. As Eijiro shook his head and heard sirens in the distance, he hurried off, saying, "I'm not the one with bricks for brains, but fine, I'm out of here, catch up when you're done." He turned away from the thug who had transformed his hand into a huge hammerhead and said, "I hope you've got something big if you're planning on trying to knock me out." Kirishima turned to the villain, his skin hardening. The thug with the hammer for a fist looked at the hardened Red Riot, then let go of his quirk and sat back down. "Take your best shot if you think you can." "Smart thinking," Kirishima remarked. Katsuki couldn't help but question whether this was actually Izuku as he ran. Nothing had indicated that it was Izuku under that hood in all the days he had been here, but the lack of proof wasn't proof of shit. It had been years since Katsuki had felt so anxious. He believed that he had moved on from the terrified child who had destroyed his friend's life. However, Katsuki was aware of the reason behind his emotions. If this were Izuku, what would he do? Was Izuku, after all, Ifrit? The questions continued to mount. Izuku was doing what? Heroes didn't do this, but perhaps that was the idea. Although heroes don't kill, the people of Kamino needed something that would make villains fearful. Was he this villain killer because of what transpired after Izuku saved him? At this moment, Katsuki couldn't help but think of Stain. Iida had foolishly pursued him for retribution, but he and Shoko had prevented the psycho from killing her. It turned out that Stain had been exactly like him and Izuku, even though they had managed to capture the hero killer. Someone who aspired to be a hero but saw the actions of some heroes and used that as justification to eliminate what he dubbed fakes. Katsuki gave a headshake. Going around in circles was pointless. He wouldn't know what to do until he tore off Ifrit's hood and looked him in the face. Only then would he be able to get his answers. Katsuki's phone rang while he was running. He wasn't let down when he thought it would be Iida, but the text's contents caught him off guard. "Todoroki knows, she's with me." As the first rays of dawn crept toward the slumbering community, Chronostasis arrived on the outskirts of the small town. He got out of the vehicle and approached the dozen or so Yakuza that had gathered. For his men, he asked, "Anything to report?" To respond to their leader's query, one of them moved forward. Chronostasis nodded, and he answered, "Not yet, sir. The place seems to still be asleep." He stated coldly that he would not tolerate any mistakes, saying, "Well then, wake them up." I promised Overhaul we'd have Ifrit's head on a platter by noon, and I do not intend to disappoint him, so you better not disappoint me." The blonde masked man yelled, "Of course boss, let's go boys," as the little army of men started to move toward the village. Chronostasis remained motionless. If he had learned anything from working under Overhaul, it was to never take unnecessary risks, but he was almost positive that this operation would go off without a hitch. He would remain here until Ifrit was resolved. When Granny B heard a gunshot, she was startled out of her slumber in her chair slouched over her workbench. "What the hell?" she exclaimed, leaping to her feet and scanning her surroundings. Ash was still sleeping on the little cot when she looked at him. She was aware that he was still asleep and apparently pain-free because she could hear his deep, rhythmic breathing. Knowing Ash was safe, she went to her shutter and, while lying on her stomach, opened it just enough to get a glimpse. The town was filled with strangers, and she saw them drugging and kicking in people's doors. Those who resisted too much or were too slow to obey orders were beaten and taken away. Then Granny noticed a big man approaching her home from the front. With the long upper lip of a simian and deep brown fur growing from his clothing, he could only be described as apish. Before approaching Ash, Granny hurriedly and silently closed the shutter. She had limited time because as soon as that oaf noticed that her house was empty, he would undoubtedly come here next, and if he saw Ash, it would end before it even got started. Before throwing a few scraps of metal over the young man, Granny grabbed a heavy tarp and threw it over him. She tried to make it as comfortable as possible while still concealing his chest's constant rise and fall. Her last action was to dash to her desk, tear a piece of paper off, and take a pencil from a nearby cup, tipping it over and spilling the other writing implements. With haste, Granny wrote something on the paper and wrapped the new mask and suit around it. Although she would have preferred to have done more work on the suit, she was certain that it was battle-ready, and for the time being, that was all she could hope for. She heard a banging on the shutter door and tucked the note and suit under the tarp on top of Ash's chest. "Open up. I know you're in there." Granny staggered as fast as she could to get away from the tarp. The farther she could get from it, the better. Granny B was about to fall at the feet of the ape-like thug when the shutter opened. She yelled, "Who's there? I can't see," before being lifted off her feet by a big fist that grabbed her by the collar. She could see the thug's face clearly with her echolocation, of course, but the less dangerous she appeared, the better. In an attempt to make her disability seem as plausible as possible, she yelled, "Who are you? What do you want?" and opened her eyes wide to display the milky orbs. After grunting, the thug threw her onto her driveway's pavement. The Yakuza yelled, "Not my problem, now get moving you old bag," as Granny slowly stood up, checking to make sure he was following her and keeping the garage door open. Granny was taken to the holding area for the town's residents. They had all been rounded up in the town center. She received one last shove into the crowd from the Yakuza behind her. As she felt the hands of the villagers attempting to comfort her, she collapsed once more. As though in pain, Granny sat down and closed her eyes, but in reality, she was using echolocation to gain a sense of what was going on. "They're so numerous. I'm not sure whether Ash can manage this many given his condition, but what would that mean for us if he couldn't?" One of the Yakuza called out to them as Granny continued to consider their predicament. "Okay, stop talking like hillbillies and pay attention," said the young, blonde Yakuza member wearing a mask resembling a beak. A big bald man with crystal eyes in a plain white hospital face mask stood by his sides. The other was a slender, short man with a sack on his head that had been stitched across the lower half and had holes torn out for his eyes. "Now we're here for one reason and one reason only, Ifrit. Give him up and you hicks can go back to whatever passes for living out here in the boonies. If you don't, well, things will get really bad really quick." The residents of the town pressed closer together, clutching their kids and attempting to appear as small as they could. The townspeople looked around at one another, their faces showing confusion. "Now then, this will be the first time I ask. Where is Ifrit?" they asked. This Ifrit was unknown to them. The blonde Yakuza Toya Setsuno shook his head. He clapped the man with the bag on the shoulder and said, "All right, then. Sorimitsu, take a bite." In order to pop the stitches and expose his mouth, Sorimitsu stepped forward and pulled on the bottom of his mask. He advanced, his bloodshot eyes darting across the entire town before coming to a halt in front of a single man. The man shook a little as he looked at him. In a flash, Sorimitsu sprang forward, seized the man by the neck and arm, and sank his teeth into his shoulder. As his flesh was ripped from him, the victim of such an unexpected attack screamed and gripped his ravaged shoulder, blood splattering onto the ground and running down his arms. Granny clenched her withered fists and closed her eyes tightly. She tried in vain to block out the man's pain, thinking, I'm so sorry, but I can't tell them." Ash will stop them, I know he will, he just needs time. That's what's going to happen each time one of you doesn't give us what we want. So I ask again. Where is Ifrit? The screams caused Izuku's eyes to pop open. His eyes were getting used to the darkness. He appeared to be covered by a tarp. Was he taken prisoner? No, he wasn't bound or anything, so that couldn't be it. Izuku slowly sat up, allowing a package that had been resting on his chest to drop away along with the tarp that had covered him. Some of the scrap metal that had been covering him dropped to the ground and began to clatter noisily as he sat up. Izuku heard a voice just as he was beginning to put everything together. I heard something over here. Izuku carefully slipped out of the cot and walked to the side of the garage opening, setting everything else aside. He saw two shadows moving toward the garage. It could have been a cat or something. I saw Enma take some old lady away from here. You know how old people are with cats. A Yakuza replied. The other shook his head, and Izuku saw it. Izuku, who was skilled at judging distances because of his master's training, watched the shadows approach and said, No way man, that was no cat. Once they were within striking range, he struck. With lightning speed, Izuku came around the door and punched the thug who had spoken last in the throat. As the thug fell to his knees, clutching his throat, there was a spurt of blood and the sound of labored breathing. Going for a swing with a flaming hand, his friend was a little quicker to pick things up. After catching the blow and draining the man's fist of heat, Izuku threw the man onto his back with a shoulder throw and then slammed his foot against his throat. As he twisted it, he heard cartilage breaking beneath his foot, snapping the man's neck. As he tried in vain to catch his breath, Izuku turned to face the other Yakuza. Izuku approached him, seized the man by the chin and the top of his head, and then viciously twisted. There was a crack, but no one heard it. After swiftly dragging the two thugs out of view, Izuku returned to Granny's garage. A piece of paper dropped to the floor as he picked up the folded object on his chest and allowed it to unfold, revealing what it was. Izuku recognized Granny's handwriting on the piece of paper and squatted down to read it. Izuku smashed the note in his fist and said, Ash, there are villains in the town. He then got up and turned to face his new suit. He grinned at the monstrous mask he was going to put on. As the Team Idaidan van raced to its destination, Iida was seated in the back. The police had quickly located and followed the vehicles using their license plates. They were on this road leaving Tokyo at the time of their last known sighting. Because of who was riding with him, he couldn't help but bounce his legs nervously. Shoko sat beside him in utter silence. Iida, to his credit, had made an effort to prevent Shoko from joining, but he had to come clean because she was being unusually obstinate about it. He had told her everything about Ifrit, including Bakugo's suggestion that she and her father should stay apart in order to preserve confidentiality. Shoko became even more determined to accompany him, so he reluctantly agreed to let her along, even though he had hoped she would see the intelligence in Iida and Bakugo's plans. She hadn't said a word since getting into the van. He wanted to know what was on her mind, but decided it would be best to keep it to himself. Rather, he spent some time texting Bakugo to let him know where they were going. After he informed Bakugo that Shoko was fully aware of everything, Bakugo bombarded his phone with angry emails accusing him of being a complete moron. He honestly didn't understand the significance of the situation. It was probably best to keep Endeavor out of this, but Bakugo was so determined to keep Shoko out of this situation that he had been ignoring her texts and calls. Beside him, Shoko was following Iida's line of thought. Why did Katsuki seem to be trying to keep her in the dark about this? What was it about Ifrit that made Katsuki want to hide him? Then, when she looked him in the eyes, she felt as though she knew this Ifrit. Overall, it wasn't shocking that he knew her name. A random vigilante knowing her name wasn't all that unusual because more and more villains were researching heroes, but the way he said it stuck with her. After hearing Iida's story, she informed her father that she would be pursuing another lead and that he should go to the hospital to wait for the men and women who had been captured to awaken so he could question them. Shoko. His voice kept repeating in her mind. Though she wasn't there yet, she could sense how close she was to learning whatever secret Ifrit had that caused him to call her name in that way. Ingenium were nearing the closest town on this road. It's a town called Mandalore. Iida gave a nod. Good work, stay the course and step on it. I don't know what those Yakuza have planned, but I can't imagine it's anything good. He concluded. As the van accelerated, there was a sharp change in the car. Shoko took a deep breath after glancing at Iida. She reflected, I'll have my answers soon. Was having them going to make her better or worse? Gazing at the villagers, Toya scratched his head. None of them had relinquished Ifrit. They were portraying him as a fool. Yu Hojo, the big bald man, remarked, maybe he's really not here. Yu was rounded by Toya. Toya glared at his companion as he turned to face the forest, asking, "Oh yeah, well, where the hell could he be if he's not in the town?" Looking at the vast forest on the edge of the village, Toya moaned, "In there probably. If the townspeople have no idea who we're looking for, then that's the only conclusion, right? Fuck. If he's in there, then we'll never find him. We've wasted enough time. If we don't have something soon, chronostasis is going to kill us." He yelled before raising his hand. Everyone in the town who was being rounded up by the Yakuza took out their guns and pointed them at the defenseless civilians. Before shouting at the top of his lungs, Toya cupped his hands around his mouth. "Ifrit, if you don't come out right now, we're going to waste every last one of these hicks. You have 1 minute to show yourself, or else their blood will be on your hands." Dropping his hands from his mouth, Toya pressed his watch's timer. Naturally, if Ifrit was truly absent from this town, or, worse, was heartless enough to allow these people to perish, then none of that mattered. Did the man's savagery extend to all deaths? Could he sacrifice these people's lives to continue killing people who were similar to him? To be honest, Toya would be afraid if he could. He had vowed to live his entire life following the one man he knew who was prepared to make such sacrifices for his beliefs. 1 minute had passed when Toya glanced down at his watch. He raised his hands and said, "So be it." Just as he did, a pillar of green flame appeared in front of the crowds down the street. Even through Ash's flames, Granny could see him clearly thanks to her echolocation, and she grinned. Ifrit walked down the street, his flaming feet melting the asphalt as he went, saying, "He's wearing the suit." His new suit had a black center and turned ash gray at the extremities. It ended with gray gauntlets that had a row of flames down the back of his forearm and flaming green claw tips on the tips of his arms. Flames encircled his legs from knee to knee. He dragged 2 dead Yakuza as he walked, his green claws gripping the asphalt. Flames roared from the sides of his mouth, barely contained by the metal teeth covering his face. In addition to the mane of flames that erupted from the back of his head and down his back, he had 2 tall flaming horns on his forehead. He kept moving forward, those green eyes piercing the Yakuza. As he watched the frightful demon approach them, Toya bit his lip. He only uttered, "D, don't you fucking move. 1 more step and we'll kill these fuck." Before a burning body was flung in his direction, he barely managed to move aside in time to witness the body smash against a house's wall. With his hands on the floor, Ifrit fell to his knees. The flames on his arm went out as he did this, shutting off to accumulate more heat before driving it into the ground. The Yakuza had to retreat to avoid being burned as the flames swept across the ground, encircling the villagers and separating them from their gunmen. He stood up and exhaled flames from the side of his mouth, saying, "The only ones who will be dying here are you." Chronostasis was examining his watch while leaning against the hood of one of the vehicles. They had been there for 30 minutes, and he had yet to receive a call from Toya. His patience was beginning to wear thin. Although he was aware that things took time, the longer this took, the more likely it was that something would go wrong. When a pillar of flame erupted in the town of Mandalore, Chronostasis grabbed his phone from his pocket and started dialing Toya's number. Grinning, he slowly put down his phone. Finally. Toya was too preoccupied with the flaming demon approaching his men to notice the phone ringing in his pocket. As they slid down the side of someone's house, he slowly turned his head to see his comrade's splattered remains. He got up and stared down at Ifrit after swallowing the bile that was rising in his throat. He yelled, "Get him!" as the Yakuza gathered themselves and began to fire. Before him, a screen of fire formed as Ifrit erupted in flames. When the screen disappeared, Ifrit was gone, and the Yakuza lost sight of their target. Toya yelled, "What? Where did he go?" He heard an impact and saw Yu move out of the corner of his eye before a wave of heat swept over them. Out of the corner of his eye, Yu saw a green light. In response, he crystallized his arms to block the attack. He felt cracks form along his arms from the force of Ifrit's foot landing against them, but he refused to back down while gazing into those fucking green eyes. He had seen that look a lot in his life, so he knew it. Those eyes weren't on a human, rather, they were on something that, at best, stood in the way of his goals and, at worst, was garbage that needed to be thrown out. Yu threw his arms wide and yelled, "Fuck you," before turning his arm into a blade and piercing Ifrit's heart. Before falling to the ground and sweeping toward Yu's legs in a blaze, Ifrit blasted fire from his feet to create just enough distance to avoid the blade. Feeling the heat from Ifrit's kick landing on his leg, the big man staggered backward, losing his balance. Before something slammed into Yu, Ifrit leapt up from the ground and attempted a fire-propelled knee into his chin. He glanced down and saw Sorimitsu's bag-covered face just before the villain attempted to bite him. Ifrit let out a groan as the teeth pressed against his armor, but fortunately, his new armor held as the two fell to the ground. Squeezing his chest, Soramitsu's teeth would not release their grip. He growled and stabbed Soramitsu in the eyes with a fiery finger, causing the villain to scream in agony as Ifrit's hot digit exploded his eyeball. "Get off," he commanded. Soramitsu instinctively released his grip and stepped back, keeping his face in place. A crystal boot struck Ifrit in the stomach, sending him skidding across the floor before he could stand up. He gazed at the three leaders of this event, his eyes narrowed behind his mask. The brute, the cannibal, and the blonde. He could see the other Yakuza in the background preparing to fire again, but he refused to give them the opportunity. He charged forward, seemingly ready to attack Yu once more, but at the last second, he leapt over the massive Yakuza, landing behind him and flinging out his hands, which sent flames streaking across the Yakuza's guns. They barely had time to comprehend what had transpired before the guns detonated, killing them all. Using her echolocation, she was able to see fragments of the fight from where she was sitting. She was aware that Ash had recently killed most of the Yakuza and was doing fairly well. The suit also appeared to be holding up quite well. She had worked very hard to create a strong polymer that could tolerate high temperatures and pressure. The intricate system of tubing beneath that outer layer was designed to collect and store heat from Ash's body, which was why the vents along his extremities were opening and closing. The hood he was wearing was the real masterpiece, though they could store a lot of heat before releasing it along his back and limbs. Two pliable tubes that aggressively directed heat away from his head and distributed it as two flaming horns were part of its design. Granny gave her creation a smile. "Scare him shitless, Ash." The creature that had just wiped out their men and left Soramitsu maimed was in front of Yu, Toya, and Soramitsu. Toya remarked, "Well, boys, it seems we don't have a choice," as his countrymen took out syringes and administered trigger injections to themselves. Fire exhaled along his arms and legs as Ifrit stood there flexing his fists, watching. Along with the horns, it appeared to be a novel aspect of this suit. All of this was an attempt to more effectively release his heat, and it was succeeding. He usually had to get through fights like this as fast as possible to avoid overheating, but the vents were working. Even though he felt slightly hotter than usual, he could continue doing this for a long time, which Ifrit somewhat desired. They shouldn't suffer for long. After taking the drug, Ifrit observed the two change. Crystals burst from Yu's skin, covering his body and forming two rows of spikes down his wide back. He had the appearance of Red Riot in crystal form. As his jaws widened, Soramitsu tore the bag from his head, opening his mouth even wider than a snake's unhinged jaw. Like massive blocks of enamel, his teeth grew larger and more numerous in his mouth. Ifrit noticed that Toya had not used a trigger to inject himself, but why? Was his quirk not a physical one, or was it unfit for battle regardless of its strength? The quirk nerd in Izuku babbled on about a number of possible explanations for his quickness, but the time for conjecture came to an end when Yu initiated contact. It must be some sort of emitter type of quirk. Every time the lumbering crystal giant moved toward him, shards of crystal broke off and were replaced by new ones. He saw as one crystal formed a huge spike, and another traveled down Yu's arm, creating a spiked ball on his fist. The crude weapon shattered against the ground as Yu swung down on Ifrit, who stepped aside. Ifrit immediately realized his error as he lifted his arms to protect his face from the incoming hail of crystal fragments. The crystals seemed to find purchase in certain spots, but he felt them all slam against his suit, which withstood the assault. Before someone leapt on his back, wrapped their legs around his chest, and grabbed his arms, Ifrit snarled as he leapt back from Yu's fire blast. When he turned to look behind him, he saw Soramitsu's incredibly large mouth poised to bite down on his head, so he didn't have time to worry about the sizzle of flesh hitting something hot. The ferocious cannibal had apparently discovered his head, the only area outside of his armor where his teeth could find traction. Ifrit directed his fire toward the horns and flaming mane, but Soramitsu's toothy maw closed in on him. Blisters developed as a result of the fire spreading along Soramitsu's mouth's roof and down his throat, scorching the skin there. Ifrit's fire ripped through Soramitsu's skull and the back of his mouth, causing his good eye to water as he attempted to retreat, but it was too late. As Ifrit turned to face his two remaining opponents, who were covered in the sizzling blood of their comrade, Soramitsu's corpse caught fire and began to fall around his body. He emerged from Soramitsu's remains and hurried past Yu, who blocked him with his crystal arms. Flames gathered at Ifrit's fist, and he reared back. As he punched Yu's arm, he said, "Phoenix down." He didn't exploit any weaknesses in Yu's defenses. Instead, he struck him where his arm was strongest and let his flames loose. The impact caused Yu's crystal to fracture, and those fractures turned into passageways for Ifrit's flames, which widened and deepened the cracks. He watched from behind Toya as his friend's body was covered in tiny cracks that grew wider as the fire spread through them. He could only watch in helplessness as those fissures deepened and widened before his friend burst into chunks of blackened and bloody crystal. Toya was mistaken to believe they had the advantage. This was something they could never hope to defeat. Chronostasis watched from a distance and snarled. He walked to the trunk of the car he had driven here in and took out a lengthy case, saying, "Damn it. I can't let this continue. This Ifrit is too much of a threat." He swiftly opened it and started putting together a long-range rifle. After the gun was put together, he took a tiny case out of his breast pocket and opened it. There were several tiny red cases inside. Chronostasis loaded his rifle with one of those cases. One of the Quirk killer bullets was this one. While standard erasure bullets were adapted for handguns, this prototype was intended for long-range use. Chronostasis stood atop one of the vehicle's hoods and pointed at Ifrit's head. To the best of his knowledge, that was the only aspect of himself that was not armored. For the sake of Overhaul's dream, I must make this matter. I must end you right here and now. The blonde Yakuza was backing up slowly, steadily, and gaining speed until he turned and ran. He didn't want to die like Yu and Sorimitsu, whose deaths were simply too terrible. Ifrit stepped forward past the still bleeding pieces of Yu and headed toward Toya. He looked over his shoulder with tears in his eyes, but he saw that nothing was there, and Ifrit was gone. He turned around again, but felt a firm grip grab him by the throat. Who sent you? He couldn't betray Overhaul, who had seen something useful in him in all of them when no one else did, so he couldn't betray him. Toya resisted grabbing at Ifrit's fingers, trying to pry them off, and when that didn't work, he resorted to punching the vigilante. Ifrit growled, forcing the man to his knees and staring down at him. Toya gasped, feeling the skin on his neck burn. The sensation of his skin starting to heat up made Toya groan. "Tell me who sent you." Ifrit growled again, and Toya's struggles came to an end as his air became scarce. He hoped that he would pass out soon, because if he did, he might be unconscious when Ifrit chose to kill him. Ifrit growled, flung the man to the ground, and dug his flaming claws into Yu's stomach, where he screamed at the newfound pain that saved him from the edge of unconsciousness. "Tell me." As heat blossomed in his innards, Toya weakly raised a hand and pointed in the direction that they'd come from. He wouldn't give up Overhaul, but he could give up Chronostasis. If he was smart, Overhaul's right-hand man would already be long gone or at the very least less likely to submit to Ifrit's torture. Toya bit his lip until he tasted blood, but he couldn't resist any longer. Even from this distance, Chronostasis could feel the searing heat of that emerald gaze as the shot went off. It was as if everything happened in slow motion. The jarring look of meeting eyes with Ifrit made him jump, and that small movement disrupted his shot. "Good, that will give me a solid opportunity to strike," Chronostasis said, aiming at the back of Ifrit's head. "Goodbye, demon." As he squeezed the rifle trigger, he stared at the back of Ifrit's head until the demon turned to face him. Izuku turned to the flaming ring of fire and brought those flames to himself, using them as extra fuel to fly through the air and avoid engulfing the town in his flames. Chronostasis threw the rifle into the closest car and hopped in, turning it on. The engine revved to life, and Chronostasis threw it into drive, slamming his foot on the gas. The tires screeched, sending out a cloud of dust and pebbles before grabbing the turf and launching the car forward. Ifrit turned to look down at Toya before yanking his flaming claws from his stomach and erupting his way toward the place where the shot had come from. As he drove away, he noticed that Ifrit was pursuing him and that his green light in his rearview mirror was getting brighter. He had failed Overhaul and had threatened to lead Ifrit back to him if nothing was done, but he refused to do so. As he raced down the deserted country road, the light in his rearview became so bright that it almost blinded him. As it closed in, he saw headlights ahead of him, and the opposing vehicle appeared to be a big van that slowed down and turned to block the road. On the side of the van, he read the name Idaten. That was the name of Ingenium's sidekicks. Chronostasis saw salvation at that moment and threw himself on the hero's mercy, knowing that they would protect him from Ifrit. He knew that his criminal past might be revealed during the process, but he knew that Chisaki would rescue him quickly. Chronostasis slammed the brake, hearing the tires squeal against the asphalt, and he jumped out of the driver's seat with his hands up before the car had completely stopped. "Please take me in. I give up. I'm not a Threa and I'm unarmed." When the fiery vigilante landed on Chronostasis's back and head, he was slammed into the road by Ifrit's boot, which tore at his face, causing more blood to leak from him as he moaned in agony. Chronostasis's face was slammed into the asphalt, and he felt the pain of his nose breaking against the road as blood ran across his mouth and down his throat. When the van's rear door opened, Ingenium and Iceburn emerged, and the two heroes took their places in front of Ifrit. "Stop," pointing to Ifrit, Ingenium yelled. "Don't move. Give up and take your foot off that man." Ifrit gazed at Iida, gazing into her deep blue eyes with his own luminous ones. "You'd defend this jerk?" It was the first time Iida had heard Ifrit's voice, and he swallowed because he knew that Ifrit never attacked innocent people and that he had never heard of an innocent person being hurt by him in any of the reports. It was almost a given that the man he was grinding into the street was a villain of some sort, but that didn't give him the right to judge him so harshly. Doing the right thing is more important than protecting him. You are not a hero. You have no right to execute people for any crime they have committed, nor do you have the right to use your quirk to attack them. When Ingenium yelled, the fire on Ifrit's back only intensified. Whatever their offense, after killing someone, they deserve to breathe. After endangering defenseless villagers, they deserve to see another sunrise. That is not believable to me. Ifrit yelled as he trampled on Chronostasis's head, but that violent gesture was the cue that Backdraft emerged from the rear of the van and sprayed Ifrit with his water, soaking him in it and smothering his fire. Ingenium then ran and seized the now disabled man, pulling him away. He turned to face Shoko, who stood motionless, gazing at the steaming Ifrit as he staggered back against the force of Backdraft's water. Iceburn has frozen him. Ifrit used his fire to blast into the air just before connecting, narrowly avoiding capture before he blasted fire down near the heroes in front of him. Before it could connect, a gust of wind caught the flames, causing them to rise up and miss their targets. Ingenium's shout startled the heroine into action. Ice appeared on her left side, traveled to the ground, and then surged toward Ifrit. "Gale Force has arrived," Yorashi yelled. With backup, Eraserhead emerged from behind him on a pocket of wind, his eyes blazing red, and Izuku sensed it instantly as his quirk was turned off and he started to fall. "Dude." As he landed safely on the ground after catching a branch and falling into the thick forest foliage, he thought to himself. Eraserhead remarked, "I lost sight of him," as he and Yorashi touched down. Iida was kneeling next to Chronostasis, who was regaining consciousness and picking up the man off the ground before clapping handcuffs on him. The sensation of cold steel on his wrists caused the Yakuza to quickly come to his senses. "What are you doing?" "I'm the victim here," Chronostasis yelled, but Iida quickly turned away and turned to face the group of heroes. "Team Idaten, Backdraft, and I will travel to Mandalore to assess the town's condition. Ifrit will be pursued by Iceburn, Gale Force, and Eraserhead. Don't let him get away." The two heroes nodded and saw that Iceburn was gone. "I will move to help as well once I've checked on the town and made sure it's safe." "Where did Todoroki disappear to?" Yorashi inquired, and after the three surviving heroes had peered into the forest, Eraserhead swore and dashed after her, followed shortly after by Yorashi, who used his special ability to soar above the trees. "What are you doing, Toradoi?" Iida inquired. "I can still use my quirk, that means Eraserhead can't see me," Izuku said, flexing his fingers as the fire briefly roared to life. Ifrit leaned his back against a tree and listened to the sound of someone moving through the foliage, wondering if he was being followed. "I had no idea that Ingenium would assemble such a formidable team to pursue me. I could handle him if it were just Ingenium, but he has me completely figured out. My flames were extinguished by Backdraft, redirected by that wind user, and ultimately put out by Eraserhead." He muttered to himself, "This is awful, and worse of all, Shoko is here too," as he ran a dozen feet and hid behind another tree. "I must let them go and return to that man with the white hair." As the wind started to pick up, he said, "He must be the one making the decisions, or at least knows who is." He hugged the tree and looked up at the sky, where he saw the wind user flying overhead. Izuku knelt down and inhaled deeply before aiming his hand directly at the flying hero and saying, "Deep breath, settle yourself, and slow your heartbeat." His master's words poured into his head as he inhaled deeply. "Hold it for a moment, let it flow through you, and then let it out slowly as you relax your arm and brace your shoulder." Izuku opened his eyes and let out his breath. A tiny green flicker grew longer until it was as long as a finger, and Izuku gathered fire in the middle of his palm. "Feel the wind against your skin and adjust your aim for its flow, and finally take your shot." Izuku fired the shot, and the flaming bullet soared from his palm, shooting through the canopy and closing in on Gale Force. From the corner of his eye, Yorashi noticed a small light. If he hadn't known that Todoroki was in the forest, he would have reacted instinctively to defend himself, but he didn't, and by the time he realized he was being attacked, it was too late. Yorashi was hoping to see a flicker of flame or movement, but he couldn't just fire from the hip because he knew Todoroki was also in the dense forest. This made him somewhat handicapped. The flames erupted at his stomach, scorching his suit and knocking the wind from him as he wobbled in midair, dropping several dozen feet before catching himself. Yorashi gathered wind around himself, but the bullet of flame was too small and too quick to pass through his hastily constructed wind defense. That wasn't enough. Damn it! Izuku shouted, about to fire another shot when his flames sputtered out. Eraserhead. The battle-hardened hero rushed forward, keeping Ifrit in his line of sight. He may not have the same endurance for his quirk as he once did, but for this, he could persevere. He shouted narrowly, jumping out of the way of Eraserhead's capture cloth. Izuku backflipped, landing on his hand, and pushed himself further away, looking for cover, but Eraserhead wouldn't let him break the line of sight. He would have to go on the attack because, as much as Izuku hated to admit it, Aizawa was faster without his quirk. Izuku took a step back and then pushed off his foot to close in on Aizawa. The underground hero had watched the video Ida had taken of his fight with Ifrit, who was acrobatic and seemed to prefer hit-and-run tactics, gaining distance before closing in for devastating close combat. However, that tactic only worked in conjunction with his quirk, which gave him greater maneuverability. Long-range attacks were moot without his quirk. Ifrit punched him, aiming for his throat, and Aizawa thought, the kid's vicious. He quickly pulled out his capture cloth, wrapped it around Ifrit's wrist, and threw him over his shoulder, intending to slam the kid into the ground on his back, but he may have underestimated the kid's fighting skills. Ifrit grabbed Eraserhead's sleeve to get his bearings and land on his feet, then slammed his forehead into Eraserhead's goggles, which wouldn't shatter under such an attack, but the sensation of something slamming into his face made him blink. Aizawa's red eyes reappeared, and he growled as Ifrit's flames blossomed in that moment, not enough to form another attack but enough to burn through his capture cloth and free himself. After that exchange, Aizawa had assumed Ifrit would retreat, but he came at him with full force again, dropping low for a sweep this time, and Aizawa jumped to avoid landing an axe kick on Ifrit. Because of his goggles, he was able to avoid blinking when the vigilante rolled aside and threw leaves in his face. He swiped the desperate attack out of his way, but his arm was grabbed as Ifrit slammed his shoulder into Aizawa's stomach, knocking the hero to the ground as he rolled off him and off. "No, you don't!" Aizawa yelled, flinging his capture cloth out, causing it to encircle his leg and almost pull it out from under him. Before he could break the line of sight, Ifrit snarled and turned to face Aizawa, who was bracing himself on his knees. "I don't want to fight you." Aizawa shook his head and Ifrit yelled. "What's right is more important than what you desire. I must stop you right now." Izuku clenched his fist and glared at Aizawa, who said firmly, "That's my job as a hero." He said, "And that's why I didn't want to fight you." Then he rushed toward Eraserhead, who used all of his strength to pull on his capture cloth, throwing Ifrit off balance as he leapt into the air, only to have a wall of ice erupt between the hero and vigilante, severing Aizawa's capture cloth and preventing him from being seen. Izuku's foot landed on the wall just as it caught fire, sending him into a run, but he was unable to outrun the ice enclosure that was closing off the last of the sunlight, and he saw Shoko Todoroki standing in front of it. With a stance, she said, "Then you should fight me." Izuku gritted his teeth behind his mask and looked at Shoko, saying, "I know you, but I can't say how or why, and you know me too. Who are you?" she demanded icily. The number 2 hero had been waiting for him when he got to Tokyo, and Katsuki leaned into the turn as Best Jeanist rounded the bend before plunging it forward. He got into the Jeanist mobile and was sped up on the drive over, growling, "Shit, I didn't want Shoko anywhere near Ifrit." Best Jeanist kept his eyes on the road while he spoke to his sidekick. "Because you think this Ifrit is your friend Izuku." Katsuki couldn't even muster the strength to dispute such a straightforward and unadulterated statement. Slumping in the passenger seat, he said, "Yes." Best Jeanist sighed as he glanced at his young proto copyright. "I can only imagine how you're feeling right now, Katsuki, but it's probably not going to be easy to end this." As Katsuki listened to his mentor's words, he said, "He has killed people, bad people, yes, but people all the same. Izuku, and I hope with all my being that it's not him under that hood, but if it is, you need to prepare yourself for that." As they turned another corner and entered the straightaway to the small town of Mandalore, Katsuki clenched his fist and Best Jeanist slammed on the gas. The Jeanist mobile roared down the highway, and Katsuki felt his chest tighten with each step they took toward Mandalore. He noticed a patch of white in the green, and it took him only a moment to realize what it was, and he took action. Best Jeanist's hair was blown viciously around as he opened the passenger door before leaping out and racing toward the ice dome. Best Jeanist simply sighed. "Always so reckless. I think I know who you are, and if I'm right all I can do is ask you to take off that mask and show me I'm right." Shoko watched as Ifrit's fists flared to life with hot green flames, sighing and holding out her arms. "If you want to leave, you're going to have to get through me," Izuku said, his breath echoing in his ears as he stared at her. He had to leave because the longer he stayed, the more likely he was to just give in to Shoko. She looked down at him and said, "You're going to have to kill me." "Izuku Midoriya, can you do it?" Hearing his name on her lips, he hadn't heard it in nearly a decade. No one could say it the way she did. The flames of his fists flickered, growing dimmer. Shoko saw this and walked forward. "It's just the two of us, Izuku, only me, and you're the only one. Even though it's been so long, Katsuki and I haven't given up on you." Shoko's words put out the fire in his chest and put out the flames on his fist, which Shoko took right away. Her mismatched eyes gazed into his shadowed green ones. "We never stopped thinking about you, never stopped missing you." She carefully grabbed the hood over his face and threw it back after giving him a quick glance. She saw the long, curly red hair fall over his face. This was a different boy than the one she had known as a child. He was angry, but she could still see Izuku in his eyes. "Izuku," she whispered. "Shoko." He finally answered her name in the way that only he could, and she grinned as tears welled up in the corners of her eyes. She had found him in this chilly and dark arena, and he was back in her arms after almost 8 years. "I found." As Ground Zero crashed through the roof, the ceiling shattered and they were reunited with it. Izuku automatically threw his hood up and ignited his hands, looked between the two, and made his decision. He blasted toward Ifrit, spinning like a top as he slammed down, gaining momentum and heat. Before the ice dome broke apart and exploded outward in a burst of light and changing temperature, all that was visible to anyone outside the dome was a brilliant light.
I will continue the story in next part. Till then, bye bye.